Welcome, everyone. My name is Gladys Rama. I'm the editorial director here at Converge 360, and I'm very pleased to be moderating our first session today, as well as welcoming you to our Microsoft Security in 2022 Summit, brought to you by eSentire, Ativo Networks, Area 1 Security, AvePoint, CoreView, and Acronis. The editorial staff of redmondmag.com have worked really hard to bring together some of the best independent experts on this topic for this event, so we really hope you enjoy it. Before we start today's event with these three great sessions, we do have a couple of announcements. First, we wanted to let you know that this event is being recorded and it will be available for future viewing. So you will receive an email when the replay is available, generally within the next few days, so keep an eye out for that. Second, each of today's three sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. So please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they come up so we can get them answered for you by our experts. During today's third session, we'll also be giving away something great, a Surface Pro 8, but you must be present to win. So please be sure to stay on for the entire event. And finally, we do have resources from our sponsors available on the console right now. So please do download and check those out. It's because of eSentire, Ativo Networks, Area 1 Security, AvePoint, CoreView, and Acronis underwriting this content that we can bring you this summit. So we thank them for sponsoring the summit and supporting the community. And we ask that you check out those resources so we can bring you even more events like this in the future. Now, on to the first session of today's summit, Microsoft 2022 Security Product Roadmap in 15 minutes. Speaking today at this session is Brian Posey, part of our panel today. He's a 19-time Microsoft MVP with decades of experience in the IT industry. He's also the writer of a long-running Redmond magazine column that you've probably read, Posey's Tips and Tricks. And fun fact, Brian is also training for commercial spaceflight, which he also writes about in his other Redmond Mag column, Posey's Moonshot. So please check those out. Brian wears many hats for us. IT expert is just one of them. Here today also is Chris Paoli, Associate Editor of Converge 360 and redmondmag.com, where he covers a lot of security news for us. And as I said earlier, I'm Gladys Rama, the editorial of Converge 360. So welcome to my fellow panelists. Glad you could all join us today. And with that, let's get started with today's session. So here's an overview of what we're going to touch on this morning. We're going to start with Windows security at the hardware level. That's Pluton. We have some Pluton announcements fresh from CES 2022. If you didn't hear about those, we're going to cover them for you today. We're next going to talk about Microsoft Defender, which is a really broad portfolio of various enterprise security solutions from Microsoft that has undergone a lot of facelifts the last couple of years. Pardon me. So it's worth it for us to cover, if only just to wrap our heads around where the branding is now. Next will be Microsoft Teams, Microsoft 365, Office 365. These, as you probably know, are updated very frequently, and keeping track of all those updates, even just the security ones, can be tough to do. So I hope we'll be able to shed some light on what's coming to these products for you, security-wise. And then we're also going to touch on some Edge browser improvements, followed by Azure, of course. And then at the end, as I said earlier, we're going to have a couple of minutes to answer some reader questions. So as you think of questions, please throw them into the console, and we'll make sure to answer those for you as much as we can at the end of the session. All right. So starting with Pluton. Since, as I said, it's freshly announced from CES earlier this month, Microsoft announced that the first Pluton-based Windows 11 devices are coming from Microsoft OEMs this year, hardware partners. For example, Lenovo is coming out with a couple of ThinkPads with Pluton built in. As you can see here from that big quote from Microsoft, Microsoft is touting this as a hardware-based security solution that stores encryption keys and other sensitive data right in the CPU. Chris, I'll throw out my first question to you. What do we know so far about Pluton?
Yeah, sure. Hey, everybody. Thanks for attending this panel. Pluton, which was first announced in November 2020, actually makes the current root of trust between the CPU and the trusted platform module, known as the TPM, in devices more resistant to physical tampering. The Pluton design removes the potential for the communication channel to be attacked by building security directly into the CPU. Windows PCs use the Pluton architecture will first emulate a TPM that works with the existing TPM specification and APIs, which will allow customers to immediately benefit from enhanced security for Windows features that rely on TPMs, like BitLocker and System Guard. Windows devices with Pluton will use the Pluton security processor to protect credentials, user identities, encryption keys, and personal data. None of this information can be removed from Pluton, even if an attacker has installed malware or has complete physical possession of the PC. One interesting note is just this week, Lenovo said that Pluton security chip features will not be turned on by default on the 2 upcoming ThinkPads, and we're assuming that's going to be the same for the other devices that start rolling out. While this may give IT pros some additional work to do when distributing new hardware, options are always welcome. Options, that is, unless you are running Linux, which is not currently supported on the Pluton chip.
Interesting. So here's a look at the Lenovo ThinkPad that will be unveiled at CES, or that was unveiled at CES, pardon me. And this will be the one that has Pluton built in. So Chris, these will be the first?
Yeah, these will be the first. Microsoft announced at this year's CES show that in conjunction with AMD and Lenovo, both the ThinkPad Z13 and Z16 laptops will be the first to implement the Pluton security chip. Lenovo said that the 2 Pluton-based ThinkPads should be arriving in May. Microsoft reiterated at the show that these and any future Pluton devices are aimed at helping IT secure its growing remote workforce, as the Pluton chip, in conjunction with partner hardware, will also provide data on the expected state of devices that might not be on-premise. During CES, Microsoft also reiterated its commitment to partnering with other OEMs to roll out additional Pluton-based hardware. There's no real time frame for when we're going to see the second generation of Pluton-based devices, but Microsoft was hinting that we should start seeing more this year.
Right. Well, keep an eye out, possibly around back-to-school season or the end of the year shopping season. But we'll see who comes out next with these Pluton-based PCs after Lenovo. Brian, turning to you, how much of a breakthrough do you think Pluton is exactly for people on the market for a new laptop? Or is this, not something that's bound to move people who are just looking for a new device?
Well, that's actually an interesting question. I think that Pluton is definitely something worth paying attention to because, as Chris alluded to, it's a new way of doing things. Rather than storing sensitive information in a TPM chip, which is what we're doing right now, that information is actually being moved into the CPU, so it's much more resistant to attack. Now, having said that, you have to stop and think about, prior to the Windows 11 release, how few people actually even knew what a TPM chip was. So I don't think this is something that's going to drive consumers to purchase a new laptop. But I do think that it's something that, in time, everyone will benefit from.
Right. What do you think Microsoft's endgame is with Pluton?
Honestly, I think it's tough to say, but my own opinion, I don't have any inside information. I haven't heard anything, but just speculating here. What I think we're eventually going to see is a new version of Windows as a result of this, because this and some other evidence clearly supports to Microsoft increasingly relying on hardware-based security, which incidentally is I think is the right thing to do. But Microsoft can't just go and change the operating system requirements for Windows 11 midstream after it's already been released. Customers would throw an absolute fit. So if you think back to Windows 10, Microsoft hadn't changed the hardware requirements in quite some time. I think maybe all the way back to Windows 7. and they wanted to make TPM a requirement for the next Windows, but they couldn't do it with Windows 10 without changing the requirements. So they actually introduced a brand new version of Windows. And I think we're going to see the same thing happen when Pluton gains mainstream use, because Microsoft won't be able to say, hey, all of a sudden now to use Windows 11, you have to have this Pluton chip. And the other thing that I think about is that I think Pluton will initially work with Windows 11, but it's going to work in emulation mode. And to take full advantage of that, they're going to need an operating system that can use that Pluton chip in native mode. So initially, they may even have a feature pack for Windows 11 that allows that to operate in native mode, but they're not going to want to stay there. Eventually, they're going to want to make that a requirement for all Windows so everybody's more secure, and that's where I think we're going to see a new version of Windows come into play.
Right. So potentially a Windows 12, and of course, that'll lead to a repeat of the hardware requirement difficulties that organizations ran into with Windows 11, where, you know, as I'm sure a lot of people found out, PCs older than 3 or so years would have been ineligible for an upgrade.
Yeah, and again, I'm just speculating. I could be wrong, but I think that's the direction
Sure.
Microsoft's going to go with this.
Right. How is this the Pluton? How is this really different from the current TPM 2.0 requirements for Windows 11?
Are you asking me?
Yes, Brian. Sorry.
The difference is that TPM is a dedicated chip, and data gets stored in that chip, and there are some methods that can be used to exploit that if somebody has physical access to the device. Pluton is going to move that into the CPU, making it much, much more difficult to get to that information.
Right. Great. Thanks, Brian. And we'll move on here. Right. So I think it's good to point out right now the distinction between what Microsoft is doing with Pluton versus its plan for secured core PCs. Pluton is considered complementary to the secured core PC approach that depends on a TPM 2.0 chip, as Brian was saying, to add security at the boot level before the OS loads. Microsoft pivoted to a secured core PC approach a few years ago because the earlier secured boot protection scheme that was built into UEFI-based machines was getting hit with firmware exploits, and so Microsoft decided that secure boot on its own just wasn't enough. So I think as we covered, Pluton isn't a separate chip like a TPM chip. Microsoft instead has described Pluton as being located on die and in the CPU complex. So the purpose of Pluton is to secure the root of trust between the central processing unit and the TPM, making it more resistant to physical tampering. And then I think eventually Microsoft will have control over Pluton updates, which should happen over the Windows update process. Chris, anything else we need to know about Pluton?
Yeah, sure. Just for some quick background, Microsoft last year, end of last year, was discussing its secure core approach in its hardware, which includes the HP Enterprise Gen 10 Plus server hardware with secured core server support for Azure Stack HCI. Also on the Windows Server side, it has its secure core server products from Dell, HP Enterprise, NEC, and Lenovo. Some of the protection capabilities highlighted by Microsoft included that dynamic root or trust measurement, which measures the environment that is booting is untampered and verified. This is done through Windows Defender System Guard technologies. Second, they also were highlighting the kernel direct memory access protection, which guards against kernel-based attacks when devices like GPUs are plugged into the PCI slot. Kernel VMA protection uses the input-output memory management unit to block PCI devices, unless the drivers for those devices support memory isolation, like DMA mapping. And third, they were really highlighting the virtualization-based security and hypervisor-based security. Virtualization-based security uses hardware-based virtualization feature to create and isolate a secure region of memory away from the operating system, similar to running a VPN or VM. Windows can now use this to protect authenticated user credentials and run other security features. On the hypervisor side, VBS are used to check the integrity of kernel mode drivers and binaries before they are started and prevents unassigned drivers or system files from being loaded into system memory.
Thanks. Brian, based on what we've seen from Microsoft going from secured core PCs and now to Pluton, where do you think the company is headed in terms of security at the firmware level?
I really think that this is something that Microsoft's been moving toward for a long time. They've just kind of been waiting for the hardware to catch up and for their customers to catch up. But I think that they're truly starting to realize the value of building security or implementing security at the hardware level, which I think is absolutely the right thing to do.
Right. So should we expect to see Pluton or Pluton-like technologies in other Microsoft products in the future? Like, I'm thinking maybe Windows Server maybe, or Azure Stack?
Oh, yeah, that wouldn't surprise me at all.
Right. We'll keep an eye out for that. And then hopefully the next time we do a summit like this, we'll have some updates for you all. All right, we're going to move on. Let's see here. Next product, as I said at the start, Microsoft Defender for Business. This is a new product for SMBs or businesses with up to 300 users, depending on how you define an SMB. And this is currently in preview now. So when it's released, which will be sometime this year, it will come with Microsoft 365 Business Premium subscriptions. Although alternatively, Microsoft says that you'll be able to buy it as a separate standalone product, priced at $3 per user per month. So as you see here at the slide, it supports Android, iOS, macOS, and Windows devices. It's meant to add protection against malware with some endpoint detection and response capabilities. Chris, what else do we know about this upcoming release?
Yeah, sure. Just to give a quick overview, Defender for Business is simplified for IT admins who may lack security expertise. It has automated investigation and protection capabilities. IT departments get alerts and a dashboard view of security using services. But it also integrates with Microsoft 365 Lighthouse, which is similar to Azure Lighthouse, a product typically used by service providers to work with customer environments. APIs let organizations pull security info from the service info, and it allows managers to access security tools.
But no Linux support?
Correct. Just Linux server operating systems are apparently supported just right now.
Oh, the server. Brian, how critical for SMBs is this type of security solution? Especially at this point in time, we're hearing a lot about ransomware becoming more prevalent, attacking not just big government agencies, for instance, but also smaller mom and pop shops.
Well, there are a couple of things that come to mind. For starters, the ransomware issue, that continues to be prevalent. I just saw something this morning saying that in the first 3 quarters of 2021, there were already more ransomware attacks than all of 2020. So ransomware continues to increase. That's a given. But at the same time, you have to consider perception. All of the big stories that we've been seeing in the media lately have pertained to human-operated ransomware. So in other words, a hacker finds an exploit, they get into a system, they plant ransomware, and then they unleash that ransomware at a time of their own choosing. But even though that's what's been grabbing so many of the headlines, the normal run-of-the-mill ransomware where somebody just clicks on a bad link and infects the system, that never went away. That continues to be a big threat. And that's one of those things that can impact anybody. It doesn't matter if it's a big business, a small business, an individual working at home, whatever. Everybody is susceptible to that. So I think that a product like this is absolutely needed because so many of Microsoft's security efforts have traditionally focused on the enterprise. There needs to be a solution for smaller organizations. The other thing that really comes to mind with something like this is that I think it's going to be extremely beneficial to smaller businesses because it is cross-platform. Historically, a lot of Microsoft security solutions have focused solely on Windows, but as you all pointed out, this also works with Android and iOS and macOS, pretty much everything out there but Linux. So small businesses will be able to protect all of their resources regardless of what platform it's on. So regardless of whether a small business chooses to use this or something similar from a competitor, I think that having a solution like this in place is critical from a security standpoint.
Right. It's also very welcome. It's a good point about having it be, this is a very cross-platform security solution. It's good, and I think it's welcome to see Microsoft doing that. specifically for its security products. All right, so here's a table from Microsoft that compares Defender for Business with the two Defender for Endpoint plans that are, really better suited for enterprises. As we said, Defender for Business is really for SMBs, whereas these other two plans are better suited for organizations with an actual full-blown IT department. So as you can see here, Plan 1 of Microsoft Defender for Endpoint is a new product, new as well, that's just for organizations needing endpoints or device security protections and capabilities. Plan 2 of Defender for Endpoint is for organizations wanting vulnerability management plus endpoint detection and response capabilities on top of the device security protections. Incidentally, Plan 2 was the original Microsoft Defender for Endpoint product, and then Microsoft added Plan 1 later and renamed everything. Chris, anything else to add here?
Yeah, you kind of mentioned it a little earlier, but just a few days ago, Microsoft did announce that Defender for Endpoint is now available for Android and iOS. Previously, it just supported macOS, Windows, and Linux server distros, but again, not clients. According to some of our recent Redmond reporting, it won't assess the vulnerability of applications in bring your own device Android scenarios, but IT pros with admin privileges can still enable the capabilities. For Android enterprise users, just the apps that were installed for a work profile will get assessed by Microsoft's Defender for Endpoint.
Right. And then, Ryan, you kind of touched on this already, but how big of a deal is this new support for Android and iOS, especially now with a lot of people working from home and they may be using devices that aren't as secure the way that IT wants them to be secured?
Yeah, exactly, because you've got so many people who, as you mentioned, are working from home and very oftentimes using personal devices. And if a user is working from a personal device, then IT is somewhat limited in what they can do to really lock down that device and implement the security the way that it needs to be done. So these devices have to be treated as untrusted, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that organizations are just going to want to totally ignore any thing on that device from the standpoint of security. So doing this kind of gives IT departments the best of both worlds. They still allow users to maintain some degree of autonomy with their own personal devices, but they're also ensuring that there's a level of security that's put into place.
Right. Yeah, so we'll keep an eye out, again, for when this gets released, and we'll keep you all posted on redmondmag.com, but it does seem like the time is right for something like this to come out from Microsoft. Let's see here. And now, of course, we're led to this next portion. It's worth going over what the current deal is with the Defender brand specifically, considering how many sweeping name changes Microsoft has put it through. Just covering it is confusing. I know if you're an organization using it, it may also be confusing. Chris, can you summarize?
Yeah, I can do my best. I have to look it up every time I have to write about it because Microsoft changes their minds every other day. So as we stand today, Microsoft's subscription-based Defender security services are not to be confused with its anti-malware program, Microsoft Defender, which comes included with Windows systems. Microsoft 365 Defender is the new product that was previously called Microsoft Threat Protection. Microsoft Defender, the antivirus solution, used to be called Windows Defender. In 2020, Microsoft also introduced a brand new product called Azure Defender, which became Azure Defender for Cloud, which then got a third name change to Microsoft Defender for Cloud. In general, Microsoft 365 Defender is used to protect end users on the client and app side, and Microsoft Defender for Cloud protects infrastructure.
Right, and so Microsoft has basically stamped Microsoft 365 on a lot of its security product names while simultaneously using cloud instead of Azure for others. So it's all kind of a confusing mess, and we try to follow it as cleanly and, accurately as possible, but keeping up with these changes can be a bear. So here is a slide from Microsoft that hopefully defines how these two products are generally differentiated. Although note that this is from 2020, hence the outdated Azure Defender label down there. Brian, have you had any hands-on experiences with any of the Defender products? I'm just curious.
Yeah, somewhat. And there's also one more that wasn't mentioned. They, at some point along the way, and it's been quite a while, they rebranded the Windows Firewall as the Defender Firewall, or the Windows Defender Firewall, or something to that effect.
Right.
I can't keep track either.
Yeah, I knew I was going to miss one of them.
Yeah. Any pitfalls besides the general confusion that we're exhibiting here with having the product umbrella be made up of so many moving parts?
I think that just having so many products with very similar names is the biggest pitfall. It would probably lead to some customer confusion, but aside from that, I can't necessarily think of any major pitfalls.
Sure. All right. And as we said, it's gone through a lot of name changes. The latest rebrand for the Defender product line came just this past November during Ignite. So just as a lightning round, here's where we stand. Microsoft Defender for Business, as we all just covered, is brand new. Defender for Endpoint Plan 1 is also brand new. Plan 2, which used to be the only plan, is for those who want more advanced threat detection and hunting capabilities, while Plan 1 is for people who just want endpoint protection capabilities. And then the rest of these bullets are pretty self-explanatory. So skipping down to the bottom, just this past December, Microsoft announced Microsoft Defender for Containers. It's a rebrand, actually, of two existing products, namely Microsoft Defender for Kubernetes and Microsoft Defender for Container Registries. It's being billed as protecting against fileless attacks and having multi-cloud support. So that means it supports Azure Kubernetes service and Amazon's own EKS service. Brian, is there something about the direction of this latest rebrand from Ignite that struck you, or is that particularly telling about the direction Microsoft is going?
Well, maybe, because the first thing that you have to understand is that rebrands are nothing new for Microsoft. They seem to like changing the names of things. And here's a fun fact. Windows Defender, the antivirus that's built into Windows, that had an original name, I think I'm getting this right, way, way, way back when, of Giant Anti-Spyware, if you can believe that one. And that somehow morphed into Windows Defender. But at any rate, Microsoft's got a habit of renaming things on a pretty frequent basis. One of the first examples that really comes to mind is the Windows Store apps. Those things first came out known as, I think they were called Metro apps and then Modern apps, and they went through a few other name changes, and eventually we ended up with what we have today. So Microsoft seems to like to rebrand things. So the rebranding of all of the Defender products might not be anything at all. But the one thing that does kind of strike me as I look at this list is that Microsoft seems to have taken some of its product names out of the rebranding. For example, they've removed words like Windows and Azure and things like that, which initially seems kind of weird because those are some of Microsoft's flagship products. But I think what Microsoft is really doing here is that they're trying to position themselves with customers as a cross-platform strategy and have customers think of this less as something that is designed purely for Microsoft environments and something that they can use regardless of what their ecosystem is made up of and which clouds they happen to use and that sort of thing.
Right. Again, it's great to see that, they're embracing more cross-platform support. I'm sure that a lot of organizations... Sorry, Ryan, go ahead.
Oh, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was going to say certainly not all of these are cross-platform, but some are. Right.
And it seems like a great time for them to do that, considering what we said earlier with people working from home, disparate environments, different devices. It can only be helpful, probably. All right, moving on. Teams. Chris, do you want to tackle Teams? Chris?
Sorry about that. I was on mute. As you all know, Teams use is getting more pervasive by the day, especially in the current climate. As Microsoft's last earnings report just this week, they reported that having more than 270 million monthly active users. Something interesting that is starting to be rolled out is end-to-end encryption for Teams calls. calls made in Teams are already encrypted via Microsoft 365 encryption technology. End-to-end encryption goes a step further, preventing man-in-the-middle interception scenarios. For one-to-one voice over IP calls, this feature just becomes generally available last month. This March, it's becoming available for Microsoft's government cloud subscribers. For a little bit of clarification, GCCH in the slide stands for Government Community Cloud, HI, and DoD, of course, for Department of Defense. Another notable team feature that's coming up this year is Teams Connect. This will let your organization use Teams with outside organizations via shared channels. This is currently in private preview, though Microsoft is expecting to roll it out to a more public preview this March.
Thanks. Yeah, it's interesting. Teams Connect isn't specifically a security feature, but it's good to spotlight it here because it likely has security implications, right, Brian?
Oh, I would say absolutely. Because the thing about Teams Connect is it allows you to get people outside of your organization to participate in Teams, which has been possible for a long time. But the trick was that in the past, a user who wanted to invite a guest user to participate in something had to invite them to the team. They sent out an invitation, that invitation was accepted, and then that outside user joined the team. The problem with that is that teams can be made up of multiple channels. And in a large team, there may be a very large number of channels. Some of those might be relevant to what that outside user needs to access, and some might not be. So the risk at bringing somebody from the outside in to a large team with a lot of channels is that they could be exposed to things that they really shouldn't be. So you can run into a situation where there's a lot of oversharing. So with Teams Connect, what Microsoft is doing is they're making it possible to invite an outside user to a channel rather than just to a team. And incidentally, you're also going to be able to invite entire teams of people to a channel rather than just having to invite one person at a time. So in a lot of organizations, people already have various teams of people set up. So if you're in one organization and you need an entire department from another organization to have access to one of your teams, you can just invite the team that pertains to that department in that organization, and that will be able to work. Now, incidentally, this is one of those things, for at least from what I've been told, that is going to require administrative approval on both sides. So an admin in both organizations will have to approve it before a user will be able to just invite an entire team of people from another organization to access a channel.
Right. Thanks, Brian. Chris, there was something else on this slide, isn't there?
On this one?
Yeah. Oh, here we are. The join meetings with a digital code. I guess that's pretty straightforward. Invitees will be able to join Teams meetings with a digital code. Yeah. So it's great background on Teams, and yet there's more Teams. For next month, we have manual opt-ins for third-party apps. So this one will affect third-party apps that require permission to use native features like the camera or the microphone. So in February, Teams users who are on the browser will have to manually opt in for these permissions. Although this is already something that Microsoft requires on the desktop and the mobile Teams app, so this will just be for the ones using the browser. And then later on in March, customer lockbox is coming to Teams. So this is a feature that ensures Microsoft can't access your content to perform a service operation without your explicit approval. And it's already in Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, and OneDrive for Business. So some people are probably already familiar with it, but at the same time, I think this one would be the most curious, or the one that would elicit a lot of curiosity from organizations. Brian, what do we know about customer lockbox? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. As you mentioned, customer lockbox isn't new. It already exists for Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, and OneDrive for Business. The basic idea is that if you think to way back when, the way that tech support used to be done, somebody was having a support issue, they would call Microsoft, and then Microsoft would have to say, hey, what's on your screen? They would tell them, and then, okay, we'll type this or click here. Now what's on your screen? Well, thankfully, we don't have to do that anymore. We've long had remote access capabilities, but the side effect to those remote access capabilities is that you risk exposing things that maybe you don't want to expose to whoever it is that's helping you through the support issue. Well, that's where Customer Lockbox comes into play. That was something that was introduced by Microsoft a while back to ensure data privacy, and this is coming to Teams. The idea being that data is completely hidden from the support engineer. Now, sometimes support issues may occur that require the support engineer to see some data. Maybe the issue that you're having directly affects the data, and you need to get that resolved, and there's just no way around looking at the data. So what happens in a situation like that is the support engineer actually has to submit a request to their manager with justification for why they need to access the data and how long they need to access that data for. They might say, I need this for 4 hours. So then that manager reviews the request and they approve it. At that point, a notification gets sent to the person who's receiving support and says, okay, the support engineer needs to access your data for the next 4 hours. Do you want to allow this or not? And if they do, then that engineer is allowed to access the data, but only until either the issue is resolved or that timer expires, whichever comes first. If the notification is simply ignored, then it eventually expires. I think the expiration period on that is like 12 hours. So that's what Customer Lockbox is. It's just a way of keeping sensitive data from falling into the hands of a support engineer. And that, even if you don't have any super sensitive data or anything, it's nice for peace of mind, but this is especially important in regulated organizations such as healthcare, where maybe you have healthcare data that is subject to HIPAA regulations that has to be kept private. This is just a way of making sure that you don't violate those regulations.
Right. Yeah, great point about really specialized industries with requiring that sort of control. Now, with all the constant feature updates to Teams, Brian, is there something that you wish Microsoft would add at some point?
Honestly, I think the number one thing that Microsoft really needs to add at this point is just better disclosures for end users so that they know exactly what it is their employer can see, what they can't see, what Microsoft can see, what they can't see, just to kind of give everybody a bit more transparency.
Right. All right, moving on. That was for Teams. Next, we're moving on to Office 365. Unsurprisingly, like Teams, it's growing like gangbusters. Chris mentioned Microsoft had its latest earnings call just this past Tuesday, and the company said that Office 365 commercial seats increased 16% year over year, driven a lot by SMBs and frontline workers. So looking at this slide, Chris, can you talk about what active content is and why Microsoft is putting restrictions on them?
Yeah, sure. So active content includes things like macros, ActiveX, content, and Office add-ins. Just last month, Microsoft said it was going to give precedence to policies set by IT departments over active content in Office documents. Currently, end users can bypass those policies. IT pros will be able to block active content in Office documents by policies that can't be bypassed. So that's going to come in early February 2022. And by July of this year, Microsoft will, by default, restrict the use of old Excel 4.0 macros, those files with XLM extensions. The use of XLM macros is a tactic used by Z-Loader malware and many up-and-coming malware groups.
Right. Brian, I imagine this will help alleviate a lot of headaches for IT pros.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely helps to minimize security risks, but it does so with the potential of impacting end users as well, because there are some end users who do depend on these types of features, particularly in financial services. Excel macros are a really big thing. So this is a way administrators can improve security, but they'll have to be careful about turning this on, and just make sure that they're not going to be adversely impacting their end users in the process.
Right. Good to know. Next we have Edge. Let's see here. As you know, Microsoft is dropping support for Internet Explorer this year, or as you may not know. But so Internet Explorer is losing security support this year, which means it's potentially vulnerable to security attacks. So Microsoft is really leaning on users to move to Edge if they haven't already. And it's promising new features to help stop zero-day attacks before they start. Chris, what can we expect from Edge this year, security-wise?
Yeah, so far it looks like quite a bit. So Microsoft is looking to beef up its browser's ability to stop threats at the source. The company released a test version of its web browser in the beta channel with a new feature that lets admins configure certain group policies for end-user desktops to help protect against zero-day threats. When turned on, this feature adds hardware-enforced stack protection, arbitrary code guard, and content flow guard. The group policies include enhanced security mode bypassed list domains, and enhanced security mode enforced list domains. There's also a new custom primary password feature. While you can already add an authentication step before saved passwords are autofilled in web forms, known as two-factor, the additional ability to create a custom password allows yet another layer of privacy and helps prevent unauthorized users from using saved website passwords.
Interesting. Brian, do you see these new security features as being able to actually stop zero-day attacks as Microsoft is hoping, or is this kind of a good attempt, but there's really no way to stop the inevitable?
I think that the truth probably lies somewhere in between. I think that some of the things that Microsoft is doing with Edge are going to make a very dramatic difference in their ability to stop zero-day attacks. At the same time, zero-day attacks by their very nature are attacks that have never been seen in the wild before. So I think there's always going to be something that somebody comes up with that nobody has thought of before. So I don't know that zero-day attacks are ever going to completely go away, but this should make a big difference, I would think.
Right. Great, and we have one more Edge browser feature coming. Chris, can you talk about super duper secure mode?
Yeah, sure. So late last year, Microsoft rolled out the super duper secure mode, which when enabled removes just-in-time compilation or JIT from the VA processing pipeline, thus reducing the attack surface threat actors can exploit to hack into Edge's user system. As many of you know, JIT is responsible for a huge majority of web-based bugs, so the ability to remove it reduces the attack threat service level quite dramatically. In the future, Microsoft is looking to add arbitrary code guard to super duper secure mode, which will protect against an attacker loading the code of their choice into memory through a memory safety vulnerability and being able to execute said code.
Right, and to be clear, that's what it's actually called, super duper secure mode.
Yep, makes me laugh every time.
Great. Turning to you, Brian, is removing access to JIT a huge step in securing browsers?
Yeah, it is. You never quite know what to believe about some of the marketing stuff that comes out. I'm not talking about Microsoft, but some of the third-party ones as well.
Right.
But I've seen at least some statistics that indicate that this JIT can be responsible for up to about half of the attacks that succeed. So if that's true, then this is going to make a huge difference. One thing that is worth pointing out about this, though, is that there are a couple of different ways to implement this. You can implement it in what I think they call moderate mode, and then there's also a strict mode. And if it's in strict mode, then it removes this from every website that you visit, and that does have the potential to break at least some websites. They may not render correctly. But when it's in moderate mode, then if there are sites that you visit all the time and that are pretty well deemed trustworthy, then this doesn't go into effect for those particular sites, thereby helping to increase the chances that things will be rendered correctly.
Right. It does seem that Edge, as much as we all like IE and are used to it, and is considering how Edge adoption is kind of lagging, it does seem like Edge is leagues ahead when it comes to security protection.
Yeah, I would say there's no comparison between the two.
Right. Good to know. And then last product we're talking about today, Azure. Microsoft's roadmap for Azure actually hasn't singled out any specific feature updates this year for security, although we're keeping an eye out for that, and we'll, of course, let you know if that changes and what comes out. However, just this past week, in light of the Microsoft's planned acquisition of Activision for $70 billion, Microsoft did talk about its efforts to protect Azure customers against distributed denial of service attacks, especially service providers hosting online games like Activision. Chris, can you talk about why we think Microsoft is talking about this now?
Yeah, it's a big deal. Like you said, in light of that acquisition, Microsoft just released a report showing that the majority of Azure DDoS attacks in the first half of this year, or first half of 2021, were against online game hosters like Activision Blizzard. DDoS attacks on Azure were up over 40% year over year.
Brian, does this come as a surprise?
Was that directed at me?
Brian?
Yes,
oh, yeah.
I'm here.
Sorry, Brian. Yeah.
Was that a surprise?
I was just saying, how the surprise, I'm talking specifically about how exponentially higher DDoS attacks were.
No, I don't think it's a surprise. Big platforms make for big targets, so it's hardly surprising that attackers would try to do something like this, because remember, with an attacker, it's not just about spreading chaos or causing disruption. It's also about making a name for themselves in many cases. So what better way to do that than to launch a huge attack against a really well-known platform?
Right. And in fact, something pretty notable happened a few months ago, the largest attack in history according to Microsoft. Chris, what do we know about this?
Yeah, it was a 15-minute attack that targeted the user datagram protocol reflection on port 80. UDP is the protocol used by streaming services and gaming applications. Microsoft found that the UDP spoof's flood attack represented 55% of all attacks in the second half of 2021. So yeah, it was a big one. Multiplayer game servers particularly can't handle short burst UDP attacks, according to Microsoft.
Right. Now, to its credit, Microsoft is pretty confident in Azure's ability to fight these kinds of DDoS attacks. As you can see from this quote, they've talked up several Azure features that work toward this level of protection, such as inline DDoS protection, and that should be effective at protecting latency-sensitive applications. In fact, this feature is actually currently available in preview from Microsoft partners, and then we'll keep you posted on when it becomes generally available. Right, we're coming up on the end of our hour, so I'd like to get to some audience questions right now for Chris and Brian. Let's see here. We have one from, here's a good one. Brian, I think you alluded to this earlier. Is Pluton replacing TPM?
I think that eventually it might replace TPM. For right now, no, but Pluton emulates TPM. So if you get a brand new laptop and it's got Pluton, it will initially operate in TPM mode so that you've got that emulation layer at work. And then eventually when the software catches up, you'll be able to shift over to full native Pluton mode.
Right. Thanks. And then next question. We have learned Microsoft retired IE mainly based on security issues. Edge can open sites in IE mode. Would this be lowering the security at all in Edge while working in IE mode? It's a good question. Brian, do you know the answer to this one?
No, unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that one.
Yeah, well, that's good to think about. We'll see if that does, end up causing some problems for users down the line. I'm sure we'll hear about it, and we'll report on it. Let's see. Here's one. What about support? Are there any products falling out of Microsoft Security Report this year? Chris, do you have the answer here? Hello, Chris?
Sorry, I keep muting because my dogs are very talkative this morning. You mentioned earlier that IE11 was losing support. Along with that is SQL Server 2012, Windows Server 2012, and Windows Server 2012 R2 is also losing support. Right.
And then, Brian, do you know what the recommended upgrade path is for these products that are falling out of support? Is it just to go to the cloud?
Not necessarily. There are still use cases for maintaining certain services on premises. Certainly I'm sure Microsoft would love it if you moved everything to Azure, but they also know that that's not a realistic option for every single workload. One thing that you do have to pay attention to, though, is that Windows Server 2012 has one thing that really differentiates it from every other version of Windows Server that had previously existed, and that is that that's the very first version of Windows Server that was ever widely deployed in the cloud. I mean, yes, Windows Server 2008 saw some cloud deployment, but Windows 2012 was much more widespread. And the reason why I mention that is because if you're running Windows Server 2012 or 2012 R2 on a cloud platform such as AWS, then the upgrade process is going to involve a lot more than just mounting an AMI with a new operating system and running setup. There are quite a few intermediate steps that you have to go through before you can ever get to that. So if you've got an instance running in the cloud, it's going to require a lot more planning than simply what you've done in the past to upgrade to a newer version of Windows.
Right. And I think it's good to point out that Microsoft does offer extended security updates for at least a couple of these programs. We'll have to double check. But if you're at an organization that must stay on these older products and you need the patch support, there is that option for you, although I understand that, Microsoft extended support can be pretty pricey. So really weigh that on your decision. All right. Another question for you, Brian. You'll probably know this. What is the official Defender product for servers? Is it Defender for endpoint or Defender for cloud? Which one?
Oh, gosh. In all honesty, I'm kind of like what Chris said earlier. I have to look it up every single time. There are so many Defender-branded products, I can't keep track.
Right. And here's one about Teams Connect, which, again, is eliciting a lot of curiosity from people. When you say Teams Connect needs admins on both sides, this is referring to you, Brian, on your comments earlier. Is that for gaining access for a large group or all external users using Teams Connect and per session? Seems as labor intensive as it has been, so I would like some clarity.
Okay. I would actually like some clarity on that one too, but I haven't managed to get my hands on a copy of the preview yet, so all I really have to go on is what I've read. My understanding of it is that that's only going to be required if a user wants to invite an entire team from another organization. If it's just a one-off situation where a user wants to invite a guest user to participate in a channel, to the best of my knowledge, that one isn't going to require admin approval.
Great. And then I think we have time for one more. Brian, will the implementation of Pluton, do you think it will relieve the Windows 11 requirement for TPM?
I think it's going to, when Pluton becomes more widespread, I think it's going to nullify that requirement because at that point, pretty much every machine out there will have Pluton, which is backward compatible with TPM. So TPM will kind of become a non-issue. Great.
And then I think that's all the time we have for reader questions, but we'll try to get to as many as we can after the session and then reach out to you directly with a response or at least, some knowledge of what we know and maybe some resources to help you track down the answer. We really want to get to as many reader questions as we can, even if it's not over this session. So thanks again, Chris and Brian. Everyone stay tuned. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be back at the top of the hour for our second session of the day, Top Best Practices for Windows Enterprise Security heading into 2022. And while you're waiting, please take a chance to check out those resources on your console provided by eCentire, Ativo Networks, Area 1 Security, AvePoint, CoreView, and Acronis. And stay tuned. We'll be right back with our second session. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our speakers, my fellow moderators, and, of course, our sponsors, eCentire, Ativo Networks, Area 1 Security, AvePoint, CoreView, and Acronis for underwriting this summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, here to moderate the second session of our summit called Top Best Practices for Windows Enterprise Security heading into 2022. Our speaker for this session is Ian Thornton Trump, the CISO at Sidejax. He is an ITIL certified IT professional with 25 years of experience in IT security and information technology. From 1989 to 1992, Ian served with the Canadian Forces military intelligence branch. In 2002, he joined the CF Military Police Reserves and retired as a public affairs officer in 2013. After a year with the RCMP as a criminal intelligence analyst, Ian worked as a cybersecurity analyst consultant for multinational insurance, banking, and regional healthcare. Ian, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
All right, thank you so much. And this is going to be a wild one because when I got sort of the brief and they said, Ian, do you want to talk about, best practices for Windows Enterprise and security using the Microsoft tools, it was like, well, my knowledge of Microsoft goes back to the very early days. So I wanted to say these are my opinions on things. This is not the necessary truth. Most of my contacts at Microsoft are working in the cyber threat and intelligence area. A huge shout out to my friends on the Mystic team. But what I will say again, these are my opinions, my impressions of where we are and how we got there. And I think it's really, really important to look at the history of Microsoft within the idea and concepts of security. And Microsoft has had a bit of a rough ride in the early days. And one of the things that came up an awful lot was the idea that they sometimes did things, rightly or wrongly, that were perceived as being anti-competitive. And this anti-competitiveness was really around antitrust rules. So antitrust rules is when you do something that incredibly impacts the other potential commercial success for an organization, and usually it's a government agency like here in the EU, UK, that would take on that responsibility and the company would get sued. Well, Microsoft, as everyone knows, has been in the papers for lawsuits, including a particularly nasty one with the European Commission that is still going through the process. But Microsoft included security features right from the very first days, where they modeled the security permissions of the operating system on the earliest incarnations we had of the NIST framework in order to be compliant with the government's regulations at the time. So the real question in my mind that I wanted to answer with this research was if they were cited for being anti-competitive when it came to multimedia players and bundling the browser into the software, why was no one ever raising a concern about their massive move into security? So that's one of the things that we're going to talk about because it really informs how Microsoft now perceives their security and what they're actually going to do about it. So we can see that right off the bat, the relationship that antivirus, third-party antivirus firms have with Microsoft is of paramount importance. There are certain things that if you're not given access to the deepest parts of the Microsoft code base, including kernel access, your cybersecurity solution, whatever you want to call it, will be at a disadvantage. So in the antivirus space, one of the first conclusions that I will put out there was that the relationship between the security industry and Microsoft's own security products and development has to be baked in. It has to work together. And really, you can see some early examples of Microsoft's cybersecurity essentials, and even before that, the company that Microsoft bought to propel them into the antivirus arena. And sadly, it wasn't a particularly easy ride. In the early days of antivirus, Microsoft's offering was not particularly widely regarded as being effective. And that changed in 2008. We'll see this. But during that whole period of time, Microsoft, being the dominant operating system on the planet, fell under constant attack from all sorts of different vectors, right? And to this day, a lot of the fundamentals that Microsoft has built in the operating system has been in direct response to threats against the platform and actually covers a gap in the platform and the operating system and the human beings that are prone to do unfortunate things. I can't think of a more pertinent and important security feature when it comes to Microsoft than BitLocker. Really, full disk encryption is now something that is so easily accessible, so easily configurable, and it can be deployed in your organization to protect assets that are lost. Because here in the United Kingdom, we're under a regulatory framework, as is the entire EU, that if I can prove that an encrypted asset was lost, I don't have to make a data breach disclosure. So that's kind of really exciting. Now, this is when Microsoft went the cybersecurity landscape, even back in 2008 and 2012, when they introduced this new operating system called Windows 8. Windows 8 got a lot of hate, okay? Maybe don't ever name your operating system the 8th version because it's too easy to rhyme it. But a really interesting thing happened. They looked at what they had brought into the marketplace, and I think they widely viewed it as being not adequate and not really up to the threat for today, and they massively improved it. And this article I found on the new Windows Defender, introduced in Windows 8 in October of 2012, a review by Tom's Hardware turned the entire game around. And now Microsoft had one of the premier desktop antivirus solutions out there. And what's really interesting about that one is they bundled it, and it had probably the easiest performance of anything, because many of the services to support the antivirus were on by default. Now, there are all sorts of words that Microsoft uses, and these words are difficult because Microsoft frequently changes the names of their product, and it's really difficult to go through the world's largest website of Microsoft resources and actually find the things that you're talking about. So one of the takeaways from this is work with your product specialists at Microsoft or your third-party vendors when you're considering Microsoft security solutions, because it's very esoteric, and this is just one human being's attempt to try and figure out what was going on. The hint that your relationship with Microsoft as a third-party vendor is of pure importance is not widely broadcasted by Microsoft, but is more obvious. But an interesting document that I came across talked about this Windows Defender System Guard runtime attestation. And the first thing was very interesting that it had to say, because it provides supplementary signals for endpoint detection and response and antivirus vendors, including fully integration with Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection Stack. Okay? This was a clarion moment where it's clear that EDR solutions and antivirus solutions need access to the deepest parts of the Windows operating system in order to detect things like kernel tampering, rootkits, and various exploits running against memory. And I think our previous talk went into great depth about some of the work that Microsoft wants to do in securing the TPM stack, now known as Pluton, all the way up to the inner workings of the operating system. Things like sensitive transactions and conditional access, brokering additional security features within the actual operating system. But to be fair to Microsoft, in the historical research that I've done, there were some suboptimal moments. And these suboptimal moments are really characterized by the fact that in some cases, Microsoft overshot the mark significantly. Windows Small Business Server included a pretty major, it was also capable of running standalone in enterprise, but something called the Windows Update Server. The Windows Update Server was a way that administrators could deploy updates. And in fact, it's still in use today by some folks that I think really enjoy levels of pain because it would just stop working for no apparent reason. Microsoft made a huge change to the architecture, I think, of Windows 10 when they moved from Windows 7 to Windows 10 and made updates a lot more reliable than they were back in the day. The other thing that seemed to be difficult for Windows was a firewall, a software level of firewall. I remember a lot of third-party applications were brought into the fold because of the challenges of the Windows firewall. And to this very day, the Windows firewall has now evolved into an incredibly complex beast. And this was maybe an example of where Microsoft realized that the assets of a business were going to be taken outside the comforts of the actual firewall deployed. And you have to think that, in a way, it was easier to build sophisticated firewall software to run at the operating system level rather than having businesses shell out for a extremely expensive enterprise-level firewall back in the day. But anyone that has spent time on the Windows 2008 firewall and server knows that this became, like many Microsoft operating systems and features, an art to its own. You know, just like Microsoft Exchange that we're going to talk about in a little bit has an art form to being effective within your business and requires administrative skills that are widely characteristic as godlike within the organization. Now, Windows and Microsoft are paying attention to threats that are out there, and they're seeing the evolution. And they declared war on insecure protocols. Well, not complete war, because they still support a Telnet server and a Telnet client within the operating system itself. But SMB v1, as a result of the double pulsar and eternal blue attacks, became the number one vector of extremely powerful NSA malware, which was eventually used by both the North Koreans and the Russians, which culminated in the WannaCry attacks and the NotPetya attacks. The other very interesting thing, and this is where SMB v1 really became a major problem, was it was quickly realized that in order to make operating systems work and share files and realize that, they needed protocols in order to do that. And SMB v1 dates all the way back to the earliest days of attaching computer A to computer B. And so now, in 2016, they put it in as an option, okay? And what's interesting as well is that Microsoft in Windows 10, starting from version 1709 support for SMB v1 protocol is disabled. In fact, I believe that Windows machines, if they don't detect that SBV1 is being used within the network in 30 days, they actually shut down that protocol from being used. So again, huge efforts to retire a protocol that obviously was leveraged by advanced persistent threat actors as well as government agencies in terms of allowing data to exfiltrate from the networks. And that's a really important point in that blocking 443 at your boundary edge was an effective way of countering the WannaCry and NotPetya attacks because SMBV1 used that particular port to exfiltrate your data. It's interesting now that when we're looking at the Log4j attack, that the Log4j attack, according to Microsoft's own information, could have been mitigated by preventing LDAP again at the boundary of your organization for exfiltration. The problem with LDAP, though, is it doesn't necessarily use a fixed port. It uses an ethereal port. So there's another layer of concern. But in a lot of ways, filtering for protocol, for particular protocols, no matter what port they appear on at the edge firewall network, is not really something Microsoft has done yet, other than allowing applications that require outbound ports to request that access. One of the major features that Microsoft invented was user account control, which would prompt just sort of very much mimicking the Unix environments where you need sudo in order to run a code at elevated privileges on an organization. Unfortunately, during the Windows Vista era, where it was first introduced, it was so annoying that most admins turned it off. And that was unfortunate that the implementation was done so poorly, because it actually, a lot of studies have come out, and I could point you to them, that suggest that the removal of admin privileges is one of the things that you can do, and is a huge impact for security. And now, in a contemporary environment, the removal of both local admin privileges and control of privileged access has become a very important concern for organizations from both a security and a compliance view. Right. So the Windows operating system attack surface has a long history of being pwned in a variety of ways. And what's interesting is, even though I've said some really complimentary things about how Microsoft has approached security, there are some very uncomplimentary things I'm about to say now, okay? Look at the CVE dates where we've had continuous problems with these various services on the endpoints, right? And one of the problems that we have is, unlike the Unix environment, where essentially in order to use a feature, the corresponding service needs to be installed and started on the endpoint, the Microsoft boxes out of the blue have way too many services enabled on by default. And the interdependencies between things like remote procedure call and those services create the attack surface that we have. The necessity for elevated privileges in order to install fonts way back in the day was one of the ways that you could quickly own a Windows box, right? And the fact that these services turn on by default is a real issue, because not only does the attack surface get a lot proportionally bigger, but they bind to a number of different protocols within the protocol stack of the Microsoft product, and allow for those attacks to compromise not just the service, but the entire box. So this is where, when we see the latest edition of Kali Linux, everybody is rubbing their hands, because they know that if the box doesn't have services that are unneeded disabled, it's a really easy way to hook into them, and that's a constant problem. But Microsoft got hacked. Well, every company has been hacked pretty much on the planet. But Microsoft got particularly owned by the SolarWinds supply chain attack. And this was not their finest moment in communicating to the cybersecurity community, because at first they claimed that it was source code that was viewed and source code that wasn't relevant. And again, this has never been concerned by Microsoft. But I find it very interesting that we got a huge amount of 0 days against the Microsoft Exchange on-premise platform in the wake of that particular attack. And as a result of that, we saw many businesses abandoning or quickly migrating to the Office 365 platform, because it became a nightmare for organizations' Exchange servers because of persistent attacks by nation-state actors and cyber criminals. So one of the things that Microsoft could have understood in the early days is really I captured in the previous slide, and that is a lot of the Microsoft security stack problems exist because of the legacies that they have to support. They have to support your mother's DeskJet printer from the late 2000s, along with the latest and greatest Ricoh multifunction machine. That's a huge ask of any operating system manufacturer. And interestingly enough, a lot of manufacturers of hardware or other software are loath to lifecycle management them out of existence. But yet, interestingly enough, Microsoft, and I think it's really bold, and I think it's one of the best things they could do for security, is pulling the plug on operating systems that have been around for a long time and that are showing their age. But unfortunately, a lot of the times that showing their age is legacy code that is then rolled forward into the new operating system. Right. So Microsoft saw a couple of really interesting opportunity spaces for themselves in the digital transformation. And I think digital transformation really began with almost the widespread outbreaks of malware and CryptoLocker. I'm calling it around 2015. But Microsoft has a huge opportunity space and the resources to effectively execute it. So they have the largest ecosystem of endpoints on the planet. Therefore, they do have the largest malicious telemetry gathering capability. There's one area of capability that they don't particularly have, and that's because 62.5% of the world uses Chrome browser. And the relationship between Chrome's telemetry and the Microsoft stack, not necessarily all of what the Chrome browser is doing is visible to the Windows Defender endpoint without a plugin. And this is one of the things that becomes very apparent when you deal with EDR solutions that want access and need to put a plugin into the browser in order to mirror up what the browser may be doing with a persistent attack on the operating system or a software vulnerability. So there are areas where they need to improve on this. And one of the things that they've decided is they're going to make the investment and make Edge into a super duper secure mode browser. I kid you not, that's what they were calling it. And moving forward into that space in order to make and give the operating system and the security products that are layered upon that the necessary visibility into the actions as well. They have a massive research and development budget and nearly unlimited cash for acquisitions. And in a lot of cases, what Microsoft has done, especially when we take a look at the new enterprise security stack space, they have made the acquisitions and integrated the products. There's still some rough edges to this, as we'll get into. But what is coming at us in 2022 for enterprise is absolutely a massive, some people may say even game changer. Also, Microsoft has a huge talent pool, including maybe some groups that you haven't even heard of, the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center, otherwise known as Mystic, but within that there's a detection and response team and all sorts of heavy-hitting cybersecurity professionals in that. But they have an advantage of being one of the oldest vendors in the business, and as a result of that, they are dragging forward new technologies into the future that I think are going to be astounding. And it starts with Microsoft Endpoint Manager. Now, it has been called a whole bunch of different things. It has been called APT, it has been called Cloud, it has a lot of different names. And what I'm going to try and do in the next 20 or so minutes so that we have some time for questions at the end here is get into a little bit of understanding all of the different moving pieces of the operating systems and support that Microsoft offers. And it is astounding. Now, one of the things that Microsoft did, I think, in terms of philosophy, is they began to realize that the cloud and IT, traditional IT, and security are actually a business function that needs to be completely transformed in order to support this new era that we're in. And I always say in a lot of my presentations about how if security and IT are not working side by side and collaborating and have access to each other's resources, then that is the silo where the bad guys are going to get into your organization and exploit it. And that doesn't necessarily mean that that collaboration has to take place, in an emergency situation. It needs to take place on a daily basis. So I was on a panel earlier this week about where they were talking about the future security operations center, and I said it has to be intelligence-led. It has to have an investigative function. It has to have a blue team function. It has to have a DevSecOps function. And everybody's mind was a bit blown because I see security as a business problem. I don't see it as an IT problem. And cybersecurity is one microcosm of the vast amount of ways your business can get ripped off by fraud. okay? So I see it kind of in this new type of thing. And Microsoft has really gone to the floor on this because they recognize all of the different components that are necessary in order to carry out security. And that comes from compliance-driven side of the fence, i.e., putting in the right configurations in order to be compliant, and then your security stack to manage that. And the one thing that Microsoft is providing, I think now, from when I went back there and saw all of the different things, as if it's not the single pane of glass for management and security, it's at least different browser tabs, okay? We're getting a bit closer. But I would say this. One of the things that is confronted with in a lot of organizations that have a security and IT team is when you look at budgets today, about 70% on average of the security budget in an organization is the salaries of the personnel, the IT people working in there. And then the existing security stack that an organization has, accounts for about 20% of the CISO's budget, leaving only 10% for all of the discretionary stuff, training, and possibly doing proofs of concepts with other organizations. So I see Microsoft as being able to come in and say, hey, we will bundle certain cybersecurity features at low cost or at high cost because we believe that our customers that are generally consuming our products and on our platforms need to be supported and need to be secure. Interestingly enough, Microsoft sees the open source operating systems, the Mac operating system, and an Android operating system having recently introduced a Windows Defender for Mac. Okay, so they recognize that people want other solutions in the marketplace, but IT and IT security and cloud and DevSecOps want to be able to, don't want to make a department of Mac support or a department of Android operating system. They want to see all the telemetry, they want to see all the security, they want to see all the configuration in one place. And then, of course, once you have that in place and you have everything on one platform, you're able to do investigation and automation across multi-platform. One of the largest problems we have right now, and people say it is an opportunity, I tend to look at it as a bit of a disadvantage, is hybrid IT. Hybrid IT is a dilution of IT departments and a complete on its head change in the cybersecurity approach that you have to take. In general, the cloud isn't really, I'm going to say, attacked by malware. It's the services that you have running in that cloud that may or may not be attacked by a zero-day attack like Log4j. Generally, what we're seeing is it's a credential problem that you have in the cloud with identity and access management and a permissions problem you have in the cloud. Okay, so you don't necessarily need to run EDR on every server that you have in the cloud. You might need it on your edge or front end. But certainly when you're using things like SQL as a service from Microsoft on the Azure platform, you're going to kind of be able to tell the compliance people, we don't have a way to deploy antivirus on our database server because it's a service in the cloud. So you're going to have to spend some time educating them about that. Now, this is what Defender for Endpoint looks like today, and you can see that it's filled with so many pieces of cybersecurity goodness. Threat and vulnerability management is the first thing that comes out that is really important to an organization. You can waste a lot of time chasing fires. I was recently quoted in an article in Wired saying that the United States' governmental regulatory agencies telling you what the priority of your vulnerability management program needs to be was not helpful. And I truly believe that vulnerability management needs to be risk-based and it needs to be intelligence-driven. And if there is an exploit to a particular service that you're running externally on the internet, that is the priority of your organization, not potentially an application that has no exposure to the internet, is hosted locally, and is only used by half a dozen people to book their holiday vacations. So again, what this is now going to get us is a view of our estate and driven by what are the exploits that are in use and targeting assets that you have in your organization. Attack surface reduction is another thing that we talk about quite frequently. A lot of the Microsoft stack shows its age when hit by modern cyber attacks. A lot of your applications running on top of that Microsoft stack show their age. So today, when I really think about what is effective in cybersecurity, of course, it's multi-factor single sign-on to applications and to controlling access in your organization, but it's equally important to be aware of what you have exposed and how to reduce it. Of course, next generation protection, obviously the marketing department got a hold of this one. This is your traditional agent that runs on the traditional endpoint. But then they've added on as almost a bolt-on that hooks into the original concept of desktop AV, and they're calling it endpoint detection and response, which is linked to automated investigation and remediation. Finally, access to Microsoft threat experts and the ability to engage with Microsoft on security issues also is a service now that can be leveraged within that Microsoft Defender for Endpoint stack. Now, this was where I think the majority of my time in trying to figure out value propositions of this cybersecurity stack. Now, here's what I see. The ability to get the actual EDR solution onto your endpoints comes with a Microsoft E3 license. It does not. It comes with an E5 license. It does not come with the E3 license. It requires an add-on. So essentially, when you're going out to market to figure out exactly how much you're going to pay for it, it's tough. And this is where you really need to engage with Microsoft directly and find out what licenses you have, what upgrades you may require in order to adopt it. And you can see in some versions of the Microsoft operating system, your ability to get to the P2 version of Microsoft Defender for Endpoint and get and unlock that feature set is dependent on an E5 enterprise licensing for 11. Now, it even got more esoteric when you start talking about the endpoint defender for not-for-profits or academic institutions. And that's where you start seeing the A5 licensing scheme. It's interesting because as I tried to pick this apart and understand exactly what was going on with the Microsoft licensing model, I got the sense that being in academia or being in charity is a way that you can get world-class, enterprise-class security for an incredibly huge discount over what an enterprise pricing. Now, they also sell it as a standalone offering to non-Office 365 licensed organizations as well. But it's anybody's guess as to what that will actually cost you and whether or not you need the enterprise version and not the home version of the operating system. And I'm still not sure whether or not Pro will support the P2 without some sort of upgrade. So there is some stuff that literally I'm not a licensing expert for Microsoft security stuff, but it was a bit of an esoteric journey just to get down to this. And I'd like to thank a couple of third-party blogs that I was able to jump into and pick up this wonderful table that was released to try and figure out exactly what the direction of travel is. Like Microsoft, with a lot of these amazing things that they have, it requires an investment of time and effort to discover them, to go through all of the feature sets, and understand where and how it can be deployed, and ultimately how much it's going to cost your organization so that you don't have a giant bill. So we have a whole bunch of other Microsoft security stuff, I'm going to say, that is built into cloud services, such as Microsoft Defender for Cloud, the Microsoft Azure Sentinel, which is kind of a SIEM. And make sure, folks, if you're talking to your businesses about leveraging Microsoft Sentinel for Azure, please don't let that turn into the logging for compliance solution in your organization, because the bill that you might receive would be perhaps gigantic. You're going to have to discriminate on what level of telemetry you're going to push into Azure Sentinel for two reasons. One, cost. The second is really finding the signal in the noise. So it's something to be really aware of. Microsoft Intune, of course, is their platform for configuration and management. This is important because, again, it's how you're going to control either local security policies or GPOs in the future. There will be a crossover point where I think Microsoft will eventually retire management of GPO endpoints and put it entirely in the cloud. It's now sort of a hybrid thing. I understand from some practitioners that not everything that is in the cloud is found on the desktop GPO of Windows AD infrastructure, but I also conversely understand that there are things in the cloud that are different, and the behaviors of enabling or disabling those features as well. So again, that's for your admins and your security team to work together to figure out exactly what the best solution is for you. And of course, Skype for Business apparently hooks into Defender for Endpoint, which I find rather interesting because I believe Microsoft made a conscious decision to move away from Skype for Business and essentially including things like Yammer, replace it with the entire Teams stack. So it would make sense to have your EDR solution or your desktop AV solution looking at Teams behavior and the files coming into Teams and giving them the old scan before they accept it. And so I think one of the big things that I discovered and started reading in depth was really around extending the endpoint security capabilities of Microsoft's formidable stack into Windows, Windows Server, Mac OS, Linux, Android, and iOS to give more of a complete holistic solution to your organization's cybersecurity. And so I found this, again, and I don't know what it is because this is showing me that it can be, Defender for Endpoint can be purchased as a standalone product for as little as $3 per user for Plan 1 and $5.20 per user per Plan 2. And up to 5 devices apparently will be covered under that cost. But I don't know what the prerequisite costs are for that, nor am I 100% certain what exact operating systems are covered in that. Because if you think about it, the Windows Defender product has been in existence in one form or another all the way back to 2012. And I'm not sure if they're going to still support Windows 7 because Windows 7, as you fine folks know, has been life cycled out, of whether or not the new Defender for Endpoint in P1 or P2 form will cover that off. So there is a lot of complexity, and this is why I urge organizations that are considering to look at moving and migrating more to the Windows stack, really engage with your Microsoft professionals to figure out what the appropriate licensing is and what the true costs of deployment are. Now, obviously, depending on whose numbers you run, one of the big problems we have in the industry in terms of like breaching organization is the phishing email, okay? And so Microsoft and Google have really come together and said, all phishing is bad phishing, even phishing from third-party companies. Now, interestingly enough, third-party companies haven't really been too vocal on this move in the press and or possible threats of litigation because getting into a legal battle with Microsoft the size of it would be, I think, unwise. But interestingly enough, they have now bundled in something called Microsoft Defender for Endpoint Evaluation Lab, which is essentially a way of phishing your folks internally. Now, I talked to another Windows security professional who said you can do it with the existing Office 365 environment, but it takes a bunch of work to do it. But this may be now required if you use a third party to do phishing emails in your organization, a whitelisting of that third party's capability. So there's still, I think, some controversy in this decision to arbitrarily say that all phishing is bad phishing. But many organizations, I think, now are moving away from constantly phishing their organization and moving to, I would say, more telemetry-based and activity-based triggers in terms of understanding their organization's attack surface and their users' educational awareness level. A great example is that if you're on an endpoint and a task gets scheduled, which we all know from our MITRE ATT&CK framework is one of the things that an advanced persistent or criminal actor will use to establish persistence on an endpoint, invoke PowerShell being something that we're not really excited about seeing on a day-to-day on a standard user's endpoint, that should be setting off alarms in the SOC of your organization. And finally, in keeping with Microsoft's vision of sort of the cloud and the hybrid world between authentication, Windows Active Directory, protection of your secrets, and protection of your platforms, they, of course, have the Microsoft Authenticator available for app-driven authentication into their stack, which I think was an indication to me that they're trying to provide an entire authentication system based on Windows Hello platform and cloud services. And I know I've seen a lot of organizations that are doing software development supporting both the granddaddy of application-based authentication, the Amazon Authenticator, as well as seeing the Microsoft Authenticator side by side. So that was my spiel, my vision, my trying to understand where we came from, where we got to in terms of enterprise security stack available from Microsoft. And I eagerly await the questions because I'll tell you, talking about Microsoft in a security context is what I would say a bit of an icy surface, if you know what I mean.
Okay, great job, Ian. We do have some questions, and I'd like to remind the audience that we can take questions up until about 10 minutes to the top of the hour in order to give you a short break before the next session. So please send them on in now. And let's get right to them. We'll answer as many of these as we can in the order they came in. Okay, Ian, if you want to follow along in the Q&A box, I'll take these in order. The first one comes from Gil. What are your thoughts about using Edge on OS X?
So I heard it can be done. I personally, like 62.5% of the population right now, use Chrome. I find it interesting, and I wouldn't even know if the supporting structure for configuration of Edge, like, you know, your ability to push proxy information to it or your ability to accept certificates into the local store, I don't even know how all of that stuff would work on Edge. So, I mean, as sort of a neat talk for an information security conference, it'd be really cool to see. But I don't know if you'd be able to get the Microsoft Office infrastructure, the Microsoft operating system to be able to hook in to the things it would need in Edge. Cool idea.
Yeah, yes. Let's get to the next question. It comes from Christian. What are the key differences in Microsoft Endpoint Manager in E3 versus E5?
Right. So if you have E3, you get basically the Windows Defender, but you get the ability to collect the telemetry from Windows Defender into a dashboard. All right, you with me so far? If you want the sexy EDR with the automation and the threat kind of like profile and all the groups and dials, and you want that extra level of, like, I would say telemetry where you have a risk in your business of living off the LAN style attacks where your adversary is trying to move from one endpoint to another, That's where you want the extra stuff that Microsoft includes to get it into that E3 layer. And again, it can be done as an add-on. It comes bundled in the E3 licensing stack. It's an add-on in E3, but it comes all baked in E5.
Okay. There's another question from the very inquisitive Christian. And for this one, you have to get out your crystal ball, Ian.
Okay.
Any idea when GPO may be deprecated?
Tomorrow. No.
Okay.
I find it interesting. It's a really great question because if you have a kind of a new environment, you're all cloud, you're a startup, there really is no legacy, you can pretty much run all of your GPO policies from your Azure AD in the cloud, right? You don't need that traditional stack of servers. But if you're supporting legacy operating systems and you have a pretty large estate of 2012 boxes, which are being depreciated, we just found out. I hadn't actually heard the news, but and 2016 server and 2019 server. I don't think the operating systems of those boxes are going to be 100% compatible in all shapes and forms with Azure AD. Now, it could be wrong, but I know that Windows 11 and Azure AD have been like sort of lockstep in development. But I know that some folks back in the day, in the Windows 7 days and the early server days, Azure AD would just simply stop working and syncing, and you had to go back to and have as a backup domain controller to do that kind of configuration.
Okay, great. Let's keep that GPO train rolling. Next question.
All right, man.
What's the difference between a GPO and a local security policy? They seem to be the exact same things.
Yeah, they are. So this is, again, where, Microsoft has gone back and believes it, and everyone on this call, especially if they've been in the industry for a long time, always has those folks that they've never had a server. They've never done a server environment. So a GPO for users and for local or security policy is essentially the same thing, but one applies to the workstation not connected to a domain and not managed by a domain. But if you want to set a default setting on your Windows parent's computer, you would go to the local security policy to enable that. In enterprise land, because everybody likes everything the same, right? You want to set a 20-minute screensaver default across every operating system, every platform that you can manage in your Windows. You're one click of the button away from doing that with a GPO. So I hope that makes sense.
I do too. Okay, the last question comes from Deepak. Does Microsoft Authenticator for one-time password work well with Windows 11/Edge and accessing applications in the cloud?
Okay, that's really good. So Windows 11 and Edge absolutely designed to support Microsoft Authenticator. But when you say applications in the cloud, if they're a Microsoft application, chances are the answer is yes. If they're not a Microsoft application, the answer is maybe, if they've programmatically done that. I've seen a lot of cases where your options are either SMS or the Google Authenticator or the Amazon Authenticator, or maybe even a third-party authenticator like Okta or that other one, Duo. But but basically, when you're talking about applications and authentication in the cloud, if it's a third party, it's basically anybody's ballgame. And this is why I think when you do configure it, first of all, keep those backup codes. That's critical. But the second thing is have an alternative way of gaining access to the platform via SMS, for instance, right? Because otherwise you can be in that uncomfortable position of accidentally having a vice president of your organization locked out, and you're trying to get them back into their system.
Okay, great. Well, it looks like that's all the questions we have time for. So thanks again, Ian, for a great presentation and answering those questions. And
You're
everyone
welcome.
else?
My pleasure.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Everyone else, please stay tuned. We're going to take a short break and be back at the top of the hour for our third session, hottest third-party tools, and the giveaway of our Surface Pro 8, for which you must be present to win. Hang on, we'll be right back.
Welcome back to our third session. Becky, please take it away.
Hi, everybody. Happy Friday, and welcome back to this third and final session of the day. We have some housekeeping. I'm Becky Nagel, by the way. I'm the Vice President of Web here, and I'm really excited. I love hosting these sessions. I love hosting these summits. We love having you. Thank you so much for being here with us today. We do have some housekeeping really quickly before we start because we've got a lot going on today. But we wanted to make sure that you know that you will get a replay of this. It's going to get emailed to you, usually within 24 to 72 hours. So stay tuned for that because you're going to be able to watch through. You'll be able to listen to everything again. So if you missed anything, you will get that. So also, we're going to have a lot of presentations coming up. Put your questions in. If we don't have time to answer it, we're going to get them over to the presenters. So any questions you have, make sure you put them in because, again, if we don't have time to answer it right today, we will get them over and you're going to get your questions answered. Two, we are going to have 6 presenters today. We are expecting this session to go 90 to 100 minutes or so, something around there. Might go even a little longer than that. We want to make sure you stay around to the end. The end is when we're going to be doing that drawing for the Surface Pro 8. You do need to be present to win. You don't have to do anything. We just look and we have a random number generator, and if you're on the presentation, it picks a number out of everyone who's on. So you don't need to do anything. You don't need to interact to put a question or anything like that. But you do need to be present and on the call. So make sure you stay around to the end so you can win that. But also, Sue, because of the fact that we have a survey that's going to come up at the end and get your feedback, because we want to know what you liked, what you didn't, how we can do this better, what other topics you want us to cover. Our editors look at every single one of those surveys, and that's how we plan these events. These have become very popular, and part of the reason is because we look at this feedback and we take that feedback into consideration. We want to do more of these events for you, so please, please, please take those surveys and let us know exactly what you think so we can keep doing these surveys. And speaking of keep doing these events, not just surveys, keep doing these events, we really, really want to thank our sponsors, eCentire, Ativo Networks, Area 1 Security, AvePoint, CoreView, and Acronis. They're the reasons that we can do these events, bring them to you for free. They're supporting the community by doing this. They're allowing us, they're underwriting the content that we bring you. They're allowing us to bring you these events again and again, and we just can't thank them enough. Please show your thanks. Please download those resources, follow them on Twitter, go to the website, sign up for a demo, sign up to get a free trial. Please show your thanks. Let them know you appreciate it so that way we can keep bringing you the events. So, and again, thank you to eCentire, Ativo Networks, Area 1 Security, AvePoint, CoreView, and Acronis. We really, really do appreciate you. So, and we look forward to bringing you more events and events like this because of their support. So with that, I'm so thrilled to present our first speakers of the day. We've got Mark McDonald, Senior Project Manager, Marketing Manager at eCentire, and Curtis Armour, Director of Product Management at eCentire. Mark and Curtis, please take it away.
Thank you very much for the introduction. We've got a lot of content to cover in a 15-minute slot here, so I'm just going to dive right into it. So a quick profile on who you're listening to today. eCentire is one of the largest pure managed detection and response providers in the world, both by revenue and by number of customers globally, with over 1,200 now actually across 70 countries. We've got experience working with some of the most targeted companies and broader industries in the world as well, including the financial space, legal, healthcare, and other industry verticals. And relevant to this discussion today, we're a Microsoft Gold security partner and a member of the Microsoft Intelligent Security Association, or MISA. So what do we do? MDR is founded on the premise that it's inevitable that attackers will bypass preventative measures. Once you accept that premise, the game becomes one of speed. The faster you can identify an attacker in your environment and kick them out to avoid any substantial damage, the faster you get to mitigate business risk. But accomplishing this is a challenging problem, and it encompasses a lot of what you see right here. In summary, how does a business or an organization operationalize the process of threat detection and response. I jumped ahead a little bit there. Sorry about that. There we go. It requires a lot of specialized human capital and perhaps most overlooked technology and most overlooked on the last point in terms of process. This is what MDR solves for. Now, in a Microsoft context, what does this mean? So Microsoft, as you've learned in the event today, they've done a really good job at addressing the technology and even some of the process problems with their tools like Microsoft 365 Defender and Microsoft Sentinel. But the biggest barrier remains, and that's people, right? It's a very well-documented story in the cybersecurity industry that there's a substantial skills gap globally of 2.7 million people and over 400,000 in North America. That's the latest report by ISC Squared. That's kind of the seminal annual report that documents this. And at the end of the day, right, you still need to have a person who understands how attackers operate and, more importantly, what to do in the event that one is discovered to unlock the value of tools like Microsoft 365 Defender. It's an old race car analogy, right? You could put me behind the wheel of a Ferrari. I might be able to figure out how to drive it, but poorly, to be frank. There's no chance that I'm going to be winning any races anytime soon without any serious training. And unfortunately, in the game of security, losing a race can have substantial impacts financially, reputationally, and otherwise. And this is kind of setting the stage for our solution, Microsoft, MDR for Microsoft. And this is where I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Curtis, to do a deeper dive in what that means.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark. So really from our perspective, taking those high quality signals that, can help prevent, but can also help detect and respond and give visibility to our analysts is one of the main ways that we provide MDR services through the Microsoft security stack. So we have an XDR platform that we use to consume and operationalize the content that comes through, Sentinel, M365 Defender, as well as Microsoft Defender for Cloud. That coupled with a threat research team, as well as our proprietary portal for customers to consume the alerts and content that we produce, and our 24/7 365 SOC, is ultimately how we keep customers safe and leverage their existing investment in Microsoft, or if they're moving to the Microsoft stack, help them implement and operationalize that to the full extent of its possibilities and control. One of the really cool things about eSentire is how far we'll go from a response perspective. So thinking about, M365 Defender, we get full control over endpoint, email, and identity. And the extent of how far we'll go is by, isolating a machine to stop an initial spread, but also looking at removing the threat, understanding how it got there, and limiting the potential exposure to the organization. Now, if we look at, the Verizon data breach report, year after year, we see endpoint, email, and identity as the main ways that compromises occur and are able to laterally spread within an organization. Having an MDR provider able to control these enforcement points, have detection and response verticals within them to deal with any compromised situation, gives us the full control to deal with any situation with an adversary within a customer's environment. So identity, suspending credentials, email, being able to investigate phishing emails and remove them, as well as being able to remove anything that gets put on the endpoint or is used as an initial compromise point on the endpoint as a whole. The other things that we do as a business is, we have our own DFIR practice. So we have the ability, if you're in a breach situation, to be able to limit the susceptibility of business impact within 4 hours. That's our SLA. Our mean time to contain is 15 minutes. And then from there, we go into the full remediation mode for being able to resolve any potential threats within your environment. We orchestrate SOAR and human-led investigation to help resolve any situation that a customer comes across based on potential security incident. So from our perspective, one of the best ways to help layer on services onto Microsoft products is aligning with the go-to-market model. So as we know, Microsoft sells predominantly on a per-user basis, and that is how eSentire is structured. So following, the consolidation of technology, the consolidation of tools, and benefiting from the investments that Microsoft has made within their ecosystem related to, winning Gartner reports on the technology they put out, we're able to give a per-user price to fully manage the investments from Microsoft through the MDR services. That covers the M365 Defender as well as Sentinel, and then overlays all of eSentire's proprietary tactical threat response content, as well as the 24/7 365 SOC, monitoring, investigation, response, and remediation. And overall, our goal is to reduce the total cost of ownership for our customers and give them as much protection as possible to be able to deal with any potential threat within their environment.
Very good, Curtis. Thank you for that. A quick story now about unlocking the value within E5. We got engaged with a major investment bank out of New York City earlier this year. As a general rule, New York City finance firms tend to be quite a bit ahead of the curve in terms of security. They were an E5 customer, and yet they were very close to signing on with a second major MDR XDR solution, and a managed one. In other words, they were essentially ready to pay for an XDR technology stack twice. Now, you may be asking yourself why on earth they would do that. This is actually a really common challenge that we see and that we tend to like to key in on solving for with the solutions within Microsoft 365 E5, because the security market's a pretty confusing space full of acronyms and solutions that sound really similar. So even this very savvy New York City finance firm could be forgiven for almost making the mistake of buying a redundant second XDR platform. So we got engaged with them. We worked with their CIO and CFO to explain how operationalizing the tools they already invested in Microsoft 365 Defender and Sentinel was much more of a cost-effective approach versus buying a second platform. And this argument ended up winning them over, and they're a happy customer now. So some parting thoughts before we get to Q&A. I was just alluding to it, but it's a fair question to take a step back and consider what you have if you are an E5 customer or if you're one that's considering it. It's a confusing market, and a good way to think about it is, 5-ish years ago, it would have taken a lot more money and probably literally years to put together a similar threat detection, threat hunting tool set comprised of various third-party solutions versus what is available sitting right there in the E5 license level for Microsoft 365 Defender. The second point, many customers we're talking to now are using E5 as a big security consolidation opportunity. It's a way to reel in years of spend on security tools that often provide poor return on investment, and the deep integrations allow for substantial cost savings. And then finally, if you're not familiar with MDR, but you perhaps are familiar with the greater MSSP space, and maybe you were burned by an MSSP in a previous life, know that things have changed quite a bit. MDR has come a long way to be a lot more accessible and a service model that drives considerably more value than MSSPs of the years past. And MSSPs like eCentire can seamlessly and painlessly integrate in your investment in Microsoft cloud services like Microsoft 365 and Azure. So that is the end of our presentation. I believe I'm going to toss it back to Becky for Q&A.
Yes, we do have some questions. Thank you so much, Mark and Curtis. Let's go ahead and get started. Here's one right here. In your experience with clients, what are the key factors in the decisions to move security tools under Microsoft, Azure, E5, et cetera?
That's a good question. You want to take that, Curtis?
Yeah, so essentially from our perspective, the best licensing that we generally recommend to our customers is M365 E5 because it gives the full suite of services. There's also other bundles that you can get to, like M365 E3 with the security add-on, but ultimately what we're looking for is the full stack of products that we can utilize to protect against, users and workstations in the M365 side, and on the Azure side, like workloads and servers and infrastructures. So generally, those are what we recommend prospects and customers get for us to be able to integrate and then deliver services on top of.
And you can work with clients when you can talk to them and walk through what their help them with their licensing and how it's going to work with your stuff, correct?
Oh, of course. Yeah, we have an entire sheet. Our sales team is prepped on what licensing we work with and kind of what the bare minimum is for us to be able to deliver positive security outcomes within a customer's environment.
Perfect. Another question. Microsoft is XDR. You pitched your own XDR. Can you explain the difference? Good question.
Great question. Yeah. So with a company like ours, the size that we are, we need a shim on top of Microsoft to be able to orchestrate beyond just Microsoft. So Microsoft is a big focus of ours just because of the quality of products that they put out in the market and the deliverables we're able to give because of it. But there are other organizations out there that are, making their journey towards Microsoft, and they have other investments in other technologies. So for us, we have our own XDR platform that sits on top of it that orchestrates all of our response, SOC investigation, and then customer consumption of data, which allows us to customize things for the way that we run our business and operations. So Microsoft does have its own XDR through Microsoft Sentinel. We orchestrate our actions through Microsoft Sentinel on top with our XDR platform. You can think of it that way. Great question, though.
Yeah. And then we are tight on time. Again, put your questions in, guys. If we do not have time, we're going to get your questions to Mark and Curtis, so just get them in there. But I know everybody always wants to know how do they get their hands on the product, whether it's a demo, a free trial. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. We're always interested in showing a proof of value, a POV. We are listed on the Azure Marketplace for the various offerings that we have. And we do have content online to kind of walk through how we integrate with products, the value adds that we deliver on our website. So if you're interested in what we do with Microsoft and how we can help supercharge that for your organization, I'd encourage you to check out our website and our Microsoft portfolio and the associated collateral and content that we have access to.
And what's the URL?
If you go to eCentire.com and search for Microsoft, you'll be able to find the main landing page on everything we do to help empower and configure and deploy Microsoft security solutions.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much, guys. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
Awesome. And now we're moving on to our next speakers. We're thrilled to have with us now Steve Griffiths. He's lead architect for AD products at Attivo Networks, and Chuck Slate, lead architect at Attivo Networks. So Steve and Chuck, please take it away.
All right, thank you, Becky. So our focus today will be on Active Directory, which is a means to an end for attackers. It's become a really critical Achilles heel for the modern network. And we have approximately 90% of all global Fortune 1000 companies are using it for authentication and authorization. And so it's usually the first place attacker wants to go once they get into your network. They want to discover where your domain controllers are, which privileged users you have, which servers contain your files or your backups, and what your security policies look like. So it's really important that you look at your domain controllers and your Active Directory as a whole and make sure that everything is nice and secure, or it's going to be taken over. And then your attackers will have the same privileges as your administrators, and they can do anything that they want to do. Active Directory is a big target because it has many moving parts. You have LSAS, which is handling authentication services, LDAP and LDAP-S for browsing objects in your directory, DNS, and so on. So there are many places where an attacker can obtain information about your network and also exploit some vulnerability and take over. Because of this, Active Directory's out-of-the-box configuration is inadequate. So we're using a configuration that was built from Windows 2000, where some of the settings are outdated and set up for compatibility, not security. Your average administrator needs to understand the ramifications involved with making a change, because the change could break a legacy application. And there are new security vulnerabilities being discovered all the time, so it's really critical that you stay on top of it, such as like print nightmare, or zero logon, or zero-day exploits. You have to stay on top of those and either put up your own fix or make sure that you patch right away. And so the major problem here is most Active Directory administrators don't have the time to focus on the security aspect of Active Directory because they're very busy handling the IT functions and supporting the business through it. So as I mentioned briefly earlier, for attackers, it's a means to an end. Their goal here is discover what they can within the directory itself, move to different machines on your network and to different accounts, and ultimately elevate their privileges and exploit some vulnerability to take over the entire directory with a privileged account. So we have 90% of enterprises using Active Directory, which means if an attacker gets into your network, they're going to use it. It's there. They can use that to figure out what's going on. They can use that to attack all of your accounts. 80% of our breaches within Active Directory are involving privileged access, which means that they're getting in, they're taking over privileged accounts, and then using those accounts to do something else, either copy files off or initiate like a malware or a ransomware attack. And to date, we have 100% of pen testers targeting AD are able to get in, which is just really terrible. It just means that there are plenty of known vulnerabilities, and administrators aren't taking the time that they need to block these vulnerabilities and keep people from getting in. So now I want to talk a little bit about AD Assessor, which is Attivo's advantage that you can have in this instance, where you can use this to identify any vulnerabilities that you might have or misconfigurations and remediate them before you're attacked. So AD Assessor handles three major pieces it can help you with. So the first one is it scans your Active Directory forests for any security exposures that you might have. And then it gives you guidance on how you can go through all those exposures, make corrections, and block them. That way an attacker can't take advantage of them. It also provides real-time attack detection. So if you are under attack by, say, a brute password attempt, then you'll be alerted by it, both on the console and through email, and you'll know where it's coming from, so you can go to that workstation, for example, and power it down, and then re-image it before the attacker has a chance to really gain some ground and take over your directory. And we also provide, through the tool, a remediation PowerShell script that allows you to make any of the changes found to repair any of the exposures that the tool detects. So here's a data flow diagram of how AD Assessor functions. We require that you put the Attivo Cloud Link agent on a production PC. This can be either a server or workstation, although we typically say put it on a workstation such as Windows 10. It uses a standard account, so there is 0 privileges required, just a regular user. This agent pulls data from your directory and checks to see if there are any vulnerabilities, and then passes those along to the Attivo Cloud console, where you're able to go up there and look and see what vulnerabilities it's found and take the steps needed to remediate them. And also, it also subscribes to change notifications against Active Directory so that you know if you're under any sort of attack. Now I'm going to do a brief demo to show you how AD Assessor looks and what things it can show you. All right, so this is the dashboard. We see a lot of high-level information here. This is the overall health of our domain. So I'm at low risk right now because I've fixed a lot of the problems, but not all of the problems. We categorize things with a severity level. So we have very high, medium, and low severity type issues that it's detected. We also go over the number of domains that you're assessing and how many are still unprotected that you need to address, because you may have a single domain controller, for example, in one of your domains that may not have a patch on it, and that may be hard for you to pick up on without a tool such as this. Information about users, that if your user hygiene is not up to par, then that could alert you about some issue there. And then information about computers as well. And here is the findings of the exposures for this demo domain that we have. So for any one of these exposures that it came up with, I can click on details and I can see information about this any particular exposure. I have a summary of what it found. I have some mitigation steps that I can follow to remediate, what attack tools are used, and I can go on the web and read more information about the particular attack. A pretty common one, weak SMB sessions. So it tells you which policies to set up, whether that you should disable it altogether, and so on. Now we'll take a quick look at the real-time alerts. So here I have an alert, which is from a brute force attack where somebody is running a password spray, where they're trying to use a given, maybe a common password, password 1 or something like that, against every account in the domain. And the Attivo agent picked up on that in the cloud and sent it to the cloud, and then we have information on here, so we can look at the details, and we have information about the event that was collected. We can take a look at it, and we can see that there were 3 accounts here that were attacked in succession and when it took place, and so on. All right. Here's a little bit about the detections and exposures that AD Assessor can handle. So there are many tools and techniques that attackers are using. You probably have heard of Bloodhound or Mimikatz or maybe Death Star, DS internals as tools. You can use these tools to do your discovery, your move, which is typically either lateral movement or an escalation of privileges, followed by an actual compromise of privileges, or you put in a backdoor so that way you can revisit the network later on with privileges if your privileges are taken away by some other means. And AD Assessor is great at looking at all of the different techniques that you could use and mitigating them in advance. So there are many key exposures that we can handle here on a domain level. We look at things like weak SMB signing to make sure that you're able to block an NTLM reflection or relay attack. Make sure that you're using LDAP properly so that you're not doing any anonymous or unsigned traffic, Kerberos vulnerabilities, and so on, golden ticket attacks. Make sure that you have your Active Directory recycle bin enabled in case something gets, you have a batch of accounts that are deleted maliciously, and so on. We have other key exposures that we're looking for at the user level, stale service accounts, user primary group ID has been changed from domain users. We look for, insecure protocols such as wdigest and so on. We look for other key exposures at the computer level. We want to make sure that you're running laps. That way every local administrator account is unique. Make sure that all of your computers are running modern operating systems and nothing obsolete, that you have no rogue domain controllers and so on. And for the real-time detections, we're looking at things like mass account lockouts or account disabling or deletions, so on. We want to make sure that we pick up on these things so you can go and find the machine responsible and shut it down or disable the account as well. All right. At this point, I'm going to pass control over to my colleague, Chuck, and he can talk about ID and Title X.
All right. Thanks, Steve. Hey, everybody. So just to kind of recap what Steve's just walked through with AD Assessor, it's ultimately all about looking at the platform itself and understanding misconfigurations and vulnerabilities and where it could and should be hardened and give you recommendations for it, and ultimately allowing you to automate that as well. And then, as also mentioned, the ability to understand if those vulnerabilities are being exploited in any kind of way and rebuffing those. And so I'm going to just take a couple minutes and build off that and talk about ID and Title X, which is basically a complementary solution to AD Assessor. And between the two of them, you get a full-blown security audit. So as mentioned, AD Assessor is all about the platform itself, and the way ID and Title X complements AD Assessor is that it does a similar security audit to the objects, to the identities, and to the resources that are defined and running inside that platform. So, at a high level, there are basically 5 things that it's doing. It's giving you end-to-end visibility in and around entitlements. So, looking at attack paths and graphing those in a way so you can really understand who has what access and how they got it, basically giving you that attacker's view, if you will. Also doing any kind of tracking of changes to entitlements. So if you've got a user group that you've locked down, for example, and it's got exactly, maybe it's a privileged user group, and so that you can be notified proactively if ownership changes or group membership changes, or of course if an entitlement changes to that group. And ultimately what it's doing, it's giving you an understanding for which identities are at risk, those that can be exploited, and if so, how an attacker could move laterally, for example, if he was able to exploit those identities. And then finally, something very similar, looking at from a resource perspective. So, looking at your storage, looking at your virtual machines, et cetera, and comparing that against industry standard benchmarks, whether it's CIS, HIPAA, et cetera, to understand where your risk is there. So ultimately, what ID and Title X is doing is complementing, again, the platform approach of AD Assessor by telling you what kind of risk you have, where your exposures are within the objects inside that platform. So just a couple of quick examples, and then we can jump into Q&A. It's going to, the ID and Title X collectively with AD Assessor is going to be able to answer very simple questions like how many identities do I have in my cloud? Something that you may hopefully understand already, but you'd be surprised how many people just don't have a sense of it because they don't have the tools to do so. And which ones ultimately, if you're in a hybrid solution, which so many of us are, what kind of identities do you have on-premise too? And ultimately, what's the risk of those identities? As mentioned, it's also going to give you a sense of, for a given identity, what access does it have? And as you can see here from this example, and this is actually a screenshot of what you get in the console, a very simple one, but it is a screenshot. It gives you an understanding exactly the fact that, that this particular lab user looking all the way to the left has privileges within AD, within Azure, and also something we call paths. We have a client that can run on your endpoints, and it can tell you if a particular set of credentials has been cached somewhere on that endpoint. So you can get that full end-to-end understanding of what kind of access this particular user has in this example. We also, as mentioned, look for entitlement change tracking. So, do I have a privileged group? Has something changed in that? Is there a certificate or a secret that's been added to a critical app? Do I have any kind of, storage or database objects that have had entitlement changes there that I want to track? And we can dynamically generate events when that happens. Ultimately, as mentioned, this is really about risk. And so understanding very key things like, do I have inactive users? Do I have those with MFA disabled? Those that have any kind of unchanged password? Or again, applications that have expired or expiring certs, or even those that have multiple certs or secrets. And you'll notice here in the console that for every one of these counters, we also give you a graphical understanding of what the distribution of risk is. So if you look at guest users, for example, we have 4 of them, and I can tell just by the visual that half of them have a medium risk, whereas the others have a higher risk. And finally, again, getting back to the compliance side of things, so performing that same analysis using entitlements to understand what the risk of your identities is, we also can do similar or gain similar risk and understanding of your resources by taking advantage of compliance to tell you things like how are you doing relative to industry benchmarks and where you're failing, why are you failing, who's failing, and ultimately what's that risk. And with that, I'll throw it back to you, Becky, for any questions.
Great presentation. And this is such a big issue for a lot of our readers. Obviously, you had a stat in there that I think you said 100% of pen testers can get into Active Directory. Did I hear that correct?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, that is a scary stat. So I just wanted to highlight that. So we know for our readers this is a huge issue. So we have time for a couple questions. One, how is AD Assessor able to run and collect AD data without privileges?
Yeah, so it's able to read data just as a regular user is, which that may be scary in itself, but it's able to do that just fine. All users have read access to Active Directory by default.
And then what additional value does this type of solution provide that I can't get from my IGA/PAM solutions?
That's no doubt directed towards the ID and Title X side of it. I'll answer. Yeah, so long story short is those older, more traditional, if you will, identity-based tools, they're more about doing the CRUD functions on management of users themselves. They're really they're not built to also handle the cloud, and whereas ID and Title X, it will give you that same information both within ADA and within Azure, for example. And it also, as mentioned, it also has that same type of focus on resources because ultimately you need to secure everything. Certainly identities are a big part of it, but so are your resources.
And then finally, how can people get their hands on the product or see a demo? What's the best way to go about that?
Probably the easiest way is to go to our website, which is ativonetworks.com. And from there, as you drill into the solutions and our products, you'll see that we make it very simple for you to start that process of downloading and signing up for demos, et cetera.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. We really appreciate it. And guys, if you have any other questions, go ahead and put them in and we'll get them over to the guys and get your questions answered. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. And now we're up to our next speaker, and we're thrilled to have with us Dominic Yip. He is the Director of Sales Engineering at Area 1 Security. And Dominic, please take it away.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today and learning about how Area 1 can help protect your Microsoft 365 environments from phishing attacks. So, let's take a look at where we are today. I think it was like 10 years ago when, Microsoft at the Super Bowl went, hey, to the cloud, right? So back then, the cloud was a strange thing that no one really understood very well, right? You fast forward to today, everything seems to be in the cloud, right? There's a constant stream of workload, applications, services being deployed or moving to the cloud directly, right? But as you know, not all clouds are equal. So when it comes to running a business, email, remains a mission-critical application. We find that email is often one of these first services that move out of the data center directly into the cloud. And, Microsoft has done a really great job there, at migrating their on-prem Exchange customers to Microsoft 365. Gartner says, there's about, 1 in 5 employee that is a Microsoft 365 user. And, as many of you have experienced over the last 2 years, the pandemic has really pushed many organizations to accelerate that migration to the cloud. The other thing that we've seen, due to the pandemic here is that a lot of organizations, have had to scale down, either on budgets or on staff. And in many cases, security was the target of many of these cuts. Some orgs, went out and approached these budget cuts by downgrading their Microsoft licenses and removing features like ATP or Defender. More simply, removing other security defense layers, hoping that there was enough overlap in their security stacks to catch threats. This is really alarming because, even under normal conditions, with all the armor up, right, there's still a good amount of fish flowing through and exposing users to threat. So when you consider that, over 90% of security incidents begin with a phish, you can imagine that removing security layers can only make things worse. And, to compensate, a lot of companies, what they've done is, invested into training or awareness. In theory, that should comes to a well-orchestrated phishing attack, this really well-crafted phish will flow through the defenses all the way down to that human, right? Our last line of defense here. And, if the attacker happens to catch the human at the right time, they may be distracted or they'll just implicitly, trust that message because it looks like it's coming from somebody that they know. So, that definitely is a problem there. Moving email to the cloud is not as easy as flipping a switch. Many organizations just don't have the expertise or don't know where to start, especially when it comes to securing their email flows. Often they just keep the defaults so they can complete the migration with the idea that they can come back later and secure it. And with users accessing email services from all over the place, it really leaves IT in a bind where, either they are unsure what to lock down or how tightly they should be locking things down. Attackers know this, and it leaves them with a vast attack surface to exploit. So, why our, existing email defenses aren't very effective today? Well, the problem really starts with the way that these technologies are designed. By nature, they're reactive and really an attempt at recycling anti-spam technologies to stop phishing. This means that, they need enough samples to generate signatures, and once they have those, they can effectively block, that campaign that's happening. If they have too little amount of samples, that's going to cause a lot of FPs. And if they wait too long to have that perfect signature, that's just going to cause a flood of malicious messages into users' inboxes. So generally speaking, like I said, if you collect enough samples, you do a pretty good job at catching what's happening now. But once the campaign changes, right, you effectively restart the process because you need to reacquire new samples. Meanwhile, you're left exposed to cybersecurity incidents, productivity losses, and bloated inboxes. Another problem is that the attacks themselves are evolving, right? So the traditional techniques of sending a malicious URL or an infected attachment used to work. In some cases, still work pretty well today. But when the attacks don't contain anything clickable and they're very much designed as social engineering attacks, and we often find that email is sent through, common cloud services or even from a compromised account, it becomes a lot harder for these signature-based solutions to be able to detect these things. The effectiveness of a phishing attack dramatically goes up when the supply chain is compromised as well. And finally, the bad guys, they can also buy, Microsoft licenses and test their own attacks against the same defenses that are in place to protect you. So if they manage to steal, several hundreds of thousands of dollars from you for the low cost of, $20 a month for, an E5 license, that's not a bad deal, right? So all in all, not ideal conditions for the good guys. So how do we solve this problem, right? So Area 1's approach is unique, right? Having the benefit of growing up, in this new cloud era, it really has allowed us to develop technologies and approaches that themselves use the full power of the cloud. We made it our mission, to really solve this phishing problem. And we attack this through, different components. First, we take this preemptive approach. This is done through the deployment of sensors that monitors, the most sophisticated threat actors out there, typically the nation states. And it allows us to understand the attacks that are being developed and identify the infrastructure and services that are being compromised to run these phishing campaigns. Once we understand these TTPs, we then turn around, use this intelligence through our high-speed crawler, and effectively figure out what else on the internet has been compromised or likely to be compromised. For example, if an attacker is deploying a credential harvester, well, they need to put that somewhere that's reachable. They aren't likely to pay, for Azure or AWS to do that. So they'll compromise a website. And if they're smart, they're actually going to compromise quite a few websites just in case, they get patched up along the way. So our crawler will scan the internet looking for these compromised systems. And as it crawls the internet, the crawler will apply a whole bunch of detection algorithms to analyze what's being retrieved. So if our computer vision algorithms pick up a Microsoft logo, for example, right, the crawler will check and say, hey, is this website hosted on Microsoft infrastructure? Does it look like any forms that Microsoft normally deploys? If this form's collecting data, what is it collecting? And if it's submitted, what really happens? So as you can imagine, this whole process, collects a tremendous amount of data. Our analytics will clear out the noise, amplify the signals, and this information is in turn used to train models and algorithms. And we then operationalize these throughout the service. The models are really useful because they really allow us to quickly recognize threats and also quickly adapt to the new threats as they morph out, right? So, and on average, what we find is that when we pull these indicators out, we find that we're about 24 days ahead of industry here. Second, we're comprehensive. So when we scan a message, we fully evaluate all aspects of the message. Each detection engine will raise a signal, and when you look at these signals by themselves, often they're not significant, but when you combine them with other signals that are detected in the message, changes the threat level of the message itself. So the other aspect of it is that our technology also allow our customers the ability to deploy protection to cover web and network attacks by integrating directly into their next generation firewall or their proxies, or simply using our recursive DNS service. This is significant because a lot of companies will deploy technologies to protect corporate email, but when you look at user behavior, a lot of users will be accessing their personal email, hanging out on social media, and these are all avenues where they can also get phished, right? So at which point, you effectively bypass, that email security defense that's been established. We also look at the context of the message. So when a sophisticated BC attack happens, it just doesn't happen in a vacuum. We look at the origin of the message. Did it traverse any compromised infrastructure along the way? Does it pass email authentications? Things like SPF, Beacon, DMARC. And since these things are pretty easy to defeat, can we really trust what we're seeing here? When it comes to the content of the message, URLs are thoroughly inspected. If the URL doesn't align with any of our models, we can crawl it in real time. And that's regardless if the link is shown or gets you there through multiple redirections. Same goes for attachments. We break down the files, figure out if there's anything malicious. And if the file happens to be encrypted, we also have algorithms that will inspect the body of the messages or look at the flow of messages to figure out, did we see a password or did we find a password? If we did, we can crack the file open, inspect it, and at that point assess the threat of the attachment. And finally, if there's nothing clickable, our natural language processor algorithms will kick in and effectively read the message like a human would and evaluate the sentiment of the message. And we'll also, inspect the thread of the message to understand the context and if there's any consistencies or inconsistencies in that thread. Fourth, when we inspect messages for threat, the work just doesn't stop there. We do a lot of data correlation on the back end to continuously analyze and understand your organization's email patterns, meaning who are the external organizations that you do business with and which users or functional groups do they interact with. So what does a normal email look like? So this really allows us to understand these patterns, and from there, we render what we call our partner social graph, right? So this is really a baseline of your email traffic. And since, many of these other companies, also interact with our other customers, right? This also allows us to establish a broader baseline across, all these external organizations. So if an attacker has compromised a partner's email, we can detect the nuances and prosecute the message accordingly, even if it's already been delivered to the end user. And finally, to bind all this, we're accountable, right? So Area 1, was born in the cloud. We've designed our architecture to be resilient across multiple cloud providers to ensure that email flows regardless of what's happening on the internet. Even though, email is a 40-year-old technology and many startups have tried to get you to stop using email, it's still very much mission critical today and likely to be around for a while. And another aspect of our accountability here is that for the organizations that are feeling the pain but aren't really ready to move to a more modern email security solution, Area 1 is actually the only company or the only security company that offers this paper detection consumption model, right? So this really allows you to continue to leverage your existing security solution, but also you can also take a full advantage of the Area 1 benefits by only paying for the detections that are missed by your existing solution. So, how do we fit within the Microsoft equation, right? So together, the two solutions, allow organizations to reduce complexity, removing redundancy brought by the SCGs, and move you towards a more secure, modern, cloud-first architecture. We're protecting many Fortune 500 and SMB companies, right, out of the box. We provide protection across the basics, things like, anti-spam, antivirus, anti-malware. But where Area 1 really shines is really around the advanced threat detections. These threats, as I mentioned, include business email compromise, impersonation, both from a brand perspective as well as, your friendly suppliers being impersonated. And for organizations that don't have a very mature security practice or are looking to be better at getting, better intelligence or expertise into their SOC, Area 1 can also help there. We provide services around user submission triage, manage and automated phishing response, as well as insider threat detection. The other aspect of email, such as collaboration, DLP encryption, to name a few, are all native and mature, offerings within Microsoft 365. So our users continue to use, those great features. And as, companies continue their migration to the cloud, Area 1 and Microsoft here really complement each other. So here's a case study that we did at a Fortune 50 insurance provider. So after deploying Area 1, this customer has seen a tremendous increase in productivity from their users while comprehensively protecting them. So you can imagine, as a insurance company, they're constantly pressured by all kinds of attacks, especially, fraudulent insurance claims and all other types of DEC attacks. Their existing defenses were actually doing a pretty decent job at catching the commodity threats like spam and simple phishing emails. But as I mentioned, when it came to these BEC attacks, right, they were just left exposed and also burning through the security teams because they were just, having to investigate everything. So, Area 1 here really seamlessly integrated within their email flows to provide this additional level of security, but also help close the threat visibility gap that they had, giving them a clear picture of where the threats were coming from and what kind of threats were bleeding through the existing defenses. Additionally, because their users were also trained to treat everything to be suspicious, this ended up causing a lot of email submissions. And the security team, already overstretched here, had to investigate, all these submissions. So Area 1 has really helped improve the fidelity of the detections, and in the process dramatically cut down on user submissions by stopping the threats before they get delivered into the inboxes. So from a deployment perspective, we're very flexible. As a native cloud architecture, this allows us to be, deployed directly in line, right? So we can either be deployed as an MX record or after existing security layers. And for the companies that are, really not ready to move anything in line, we do have the ability to deploy in what we call near-line deployment, right? So where, the original message gets delivered normally, we'll process a copy of the message, and if this message is deemed to be malicious, via an API call, we can take action and remove the message from the user's inbox. In either cases, our message processing time is barely noticeable. It takes about 1.8 seconds to go through a full message inspection. And if you've, gone the API route, the retraction also takes a few seconds to happen. So all in all, most users don't even notice that anything has happened, and delivery just continues as normal. Our infrastructure is entirely cloud-based, and like I said, you can scale as needed. Think of a whole bunch of compute nodes behind a load balancer, and whichever node is available is going to fully process that message, meaning it doesn't have to share resources. It gets all the memory, all the compute power to do its work, and that allows us to scan very deep, as well as render a disposition, much faster as well. And also, as I mentioned earlier, having presence across multiple cloud providers really allows us to provide this inter-cloud failover, right? So our infrastructure runs in this active configuration, and that helps us ensure uptime just because we understand that, email is this mission-critical application. And then, from an onboarding perspective, right, so if you want to become a customer or just try out the solution, since we're not an appliance or VM-based, we can really instantiate your access within a few seconds and start protecting your inboxes within a few minutes. Through better security, easy deep integrations, and operational efficiencies, that are completely transparent to your users, there is a path to, to what we call the inbox.clean experience, right? So Area 1 and Microsoft, brings together, an experience, a much better experience while keeping your users and organizations safe from phishing attacks of any flavors. So really appreciate the time today, and your attention. And, I think we have some questions I can help answer here.
We do. We got a lot of great questions. We won't have time to get all of them. So guys, go ahead and get your questions in. Any we don't have time to get, we will get over to Dominic, and he'll be able to answer them later to you. But for right now, let's start with this one. Are there any benefits for deploying inline versus API? Is one better than the other? It's a good question.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And so as I mentioned, we're very flexible in that aspect. And a lot of it, often it's really driven by, the customer's architecture, right? So we have some folks that, for them, it's extremely important to block messages right here and right there. So inline is greatly suited for that. But we also have other customers that basically come to us and say, you know what, my email flows is a mess, right? It's very complicated. I'm not ready to introduce any other hops in that processing. So the API approach there is actually perfect because now we're kind of standing on the side, continuously inspecting messages, and we can just pull messages out of the inbox as we find the malicious ones kind of flowing through.
Here's another one. What additional protection do you provide over Microsoft ATP?
Yeah, so very good question. Yeah, so ATP typically works very well, but there are in some instances where it doesn't work so well, right? And our approach at detecting phishing really is where that makes a difference there, right? So often, going deep and recursively going down that URL to figure out what's that threat at the end of it, especially if it's, nested in shorteners or a lot of redirections are happening, right? Our crawlers can pick these things up, right? The other aspect of it is that, ATP, just like a lot of the, existing technologies today, is still in some ways kind of playing catch up in whatever that new variant of that phishing attack is. again, because of our models, we can detect those a lot quicker and make a decision a lot quicker as well.
Great. And finally, can you let us know how people can get their hands on either a free trial, free download, demo? What's the best way to go about it?
Absolutely. Yeah. So we're entirely cloud-based. So, here there's obviously nothing to download. But if you just point your browser at area1security.com, you can sign up for an evaluation there. We run those with our customers all the time. You can also have access to a demo environment. So if you just want to poke around without talking to a salesperson, you can do that as well. So just go to area1security.com and we'll take care of you there.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dominic. We really appreciate it.
For sure. Thank you.
All right. And guys, just a reminder, we have more presentations to go. Stay with us. You do have to be online to win that Surface Pro 8 that we'll be giving away at the end of the session. And also, again, we want you to take that survey. Let us know what you think so we can plan more events like this for you. Up next, so I'm just thrilled to have back with us. It's Eric Crucy. He is the Senior Solution Engineer at AvePoint. Eric, please take it away.
Hello, my name is Eric Cruzy, and I'm a Senior Solutions Engineer here at AvePoint. And today we're going to be talking about how you can manage risk in your M365 environment. Now, the first solution that we're going to be showing here today is Insights for Microsoft 365. And this solution is specifically intended to help you identify and take action on risk within your Microsoft environment. So the first thing that we're going to show here is that we have the ability across the different workloads in Microsoft 365 to identify areas that have external users, where there's external links that have sensitive data, and take this type of information and cross-reference it so that we can prioritize and help you as administrators or security officers or risk officers identify those areas that potentially are vulnerable to your organization. So we'll talk a little bit about what these kind of high risk and medium risk items are in a minute here. But essentially what we're doing is we're taking a look at all of the permissions in your environment, all of the areas that have sensitive information, so sensitivity labels in M365 and where those are deployed in your tenant, and also taking some other supplementary information such as where are your guest users, where are your shadow users, and these are users that have access to the underlying content within a team but are not explicitly a member or an owner. Teams without owners, teams with high-risk items, and we're cross-referencing this information to summarize in the form of high risk and medium risk. So let's take a look at what that specifically means. So if we want to look at our high risk items, we can see here that we have different files within our teams. So these are all individual files. And we can see that they have particular sensitivity information. So this one has a telephone number, this one has a credit card number, and we can also see that they have a high exposure level. So they're shared with a large security group or a large Office 365 group. And so by cross-referencing this two information, we have sensitivity and we have a high exposure. This particular file has a high risk level to the organization. So being able to take that information, which natively you would have to typically do a permissions report. You'd also have to find a report on where all the labels are and cross-reference that stuff manually. We're doing that for you automatically and summarizing it to you in a format that's easy to understand and up to date all the time. So again, this is our high risk information within Teams. Let's say I want to do the same thing in OneDrive, right? I can go into OneDrive, I can see all of our high risk items, and I can very easily, again, see what is high risk where the high-risk files are, depending on, again, the sensitivity information and the exposure level of that particular file, who it's shared out with. Now, the way in which we're able to get the permissions so quickly and easily for users and groups, and that we're actually building an index of all your membership and permissions across your entire tenant, no matter how many M365 users you have. So if you have hundreds of users, or you have over 100,000 users or hundreds of thousands of users, we have you supported and can support and scale to any volume of, again, users and data that you may have in your tenant. So this is all indexed. So if I wanted to, for example, find all the areas that Rita had access across my entire tenant, I can go ahead and do a search. And now from an audit perspective, I can see the entire tenant access that Rita has and show it in a format that's easy to consume and see all the areas that, again, Rita has access to. And I can do it by site. I can also do it by object, right? Where are all the files, which ones of those have sensitive information in them, so I can sort and filter on this information. So you can also filter. I can also export this out as a report if it's something that you need to share to site owners or your risk department or your security team and take action respectively. Other ways in which we can identify risk, I can see very quickly all the areas that maybe the Everyone group has access. So here I can see the Everyone group has access to 36 site collections and even is being granted access to 30 items. I can also see all the areas that where external links have been granted access and are accessible by external users. And I can also do quick filters, right? So we're all across all those items, show me all the ones that have a sensitivity label of high, right? So again, very quickly, I can see that access. And let's say we want to take action, right? Let's say I wanted to remove that share, right? So beyond just reporting, I wanted to go ahead and remove that sharing with that's anonymous, or I want to set an expiration, right? This one does not have an expiration date. It's set to never. That's not acceptable. Let's go ahead and set an expiration date. So that's something that I can do throughout the user interface. If we go, let's say we wanted to look across our SharePoint Online environment. So we looked across teams, we looked across groups. Also, something that we can do is do the same thing against our classic SharePoint sites, as well as our, maybe our communication sites. I can go ahead and look at all the high-risk items. And notice that we can also take action on this, right? So let's say I wanted to, we know that there's a sensitivity label, if there's not one placed on there, I can actually change or apply a sensitivity label. I can view the permissions and actually make changes to it. So let's say, here we see we have external users that are being granted access. I can actually go ahead and come in here and remove their permissions if they shouldn't be in there. So as an administrator, as a content owner, I can come in here and I can make those changes as needed. For those organizations that are large, we can also come in here and we can actually set up different groups, security groups, and security trim these dashboards to specific geographies or specific departments, or we can security trim it by sensitivity label to be able to delegate out this ability to do risk reporting across your different subunits within your organization. So that's really all on the reporting and taking action around risk. We also have in here the ability to create policies to help mitigate that risk automatically. So this is all about automation and being able to make changes through orchestrated policy settings that happen, again, automatically as incidents, or I should say policy violations, take place. So for example, let's say I wanted to create a rule that prevented certain large groups from being granted access to a Microsoft team, or let's say a group. I can actually restrict certain groups from being granted access. Let's say I wanted to prevent the everyone except external users or the everyone group from being granted access. So I can actually block those users from being granted access. Or I could say only, let's say, US based employees are allowed to have access to this financial team, or teams that are classified as financial or sensitive related. I can actually set a defined group and actually go ahead and block and remove any users that don't meet these criteria. Other things we can do is we can actually prevent team owners or group owners from switching from private to public and potentially opening up that entire site up to open to the entire company. So these are just some of the policies that we can do from an automation standpoint to help you feel secure. Once you get these set up, you can then go back to your insight reporting and then ensure and ensure that you have your policies working and your risk being mitigated. So I hope this was helpful in helping you identify potentially areas of risk and how to proactively set up rules and policies to block that risk from coming up in the future. But thank you very much for taking time to look at how AvePoint can potentially assist you and mitigate that risk across your M365 tenant.
Thanks so much for that great presentation, Eric. It's always great to see hands-on how AvePoint gets in there and does those solutions and really to see how it's working within there. So great to see that. We do have questions. I want to get in them right away. This is a good one. How does content get defined as high or medium risk?
Yeah, good question. I'm sure some of you noticed that during the demonstration that we had some items being classified as high or medium or low risk. And this is really completely up to you as a organization. So you can define this type of risk based on a sensitivity label within Microsoft if you're leveraging those today. So let's say certain types of sensitivity labels that you're applying, right, you can assign a risk score to those. Another way we do it is by exposure. So not just the data within the file, but when we're talking about who the file is shared with. So for example, an external user, right, may warrant a higher risk score, or a group that it's being shared with that has, let's say, over 50 people or 10 people, that can be defined as a higher risk exposure. So essentially correlating the exposure level, who it's shared with, along with what type of data is in that file and whether it has external access or not.
All right, here's another good question. How long does it take to get a permissions report for a user or a group? Yeah,
so really it's only a matter of seconds to get that permissions report back. You know how important it is, especially companies and organizations have to do audits, right, in their M365 environment. Sometimes it can take a long time to run that permissions report, in which by the time it completes, it's no longer valid and up to date, right? Permissions may have changed. A file that's sensitive may have been shared with someone who it should not have been, if it's taking hours to run that report. So what this solution does, Policy and Insights, is it actually builds an index of all of the permissions and membership in your M365 tenant. That way, when you do need to run that permissions report, again, it's just a matter of seconds because we're tapping into that index that we're building, again, across all of the permissions and membership of the users and groups in your M365 environment.
And you touched on this a little bit, but the question is, how does sensitive data get identified in M365?
Yeah, so when we're looking at sensitive data in your environment and we're giving you dashboards to look and see how that sensitive information is distributed across your M365 tenant, we're really relying on the native sensitivity labels and DLP policies within M365. So what we'll do is we'll use the index that Microsoft builds of that sensitive content, and we'll allow you to report and build that and create those dashboards, right, based on where that sensitivity labels are. But really, we're relying on those native labels in order to define the sensitive content. Now, in addition to that, we can also provide further classification capabilities within the solution itself. So if, maybe you don't have the highest level licensing with M365 and you don't get some of that auto classification functionality, we can help place some of those sensitivity labels on data, right, maybe based on text strings or location within files and within sites across your M365 tenant. So this could be across SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, groups, but we can also help place those sensitivities for you automatically through the solution itself. Or again, you can rely on M365 native capabilities to apply those labels.
So you don't require certain licensing for every single installation?
Correct. That's right. The only thing we do require is an enterprise license with M365. That's kind of how you can get some of those sensitivity label functionality that we do rely on. But as long as it's an enterprise license, then you're good to go.
Perfect. And then, guys, go ahead. Again, we won't be able to get to every question, but get them in. We'll get them over to Eric. Eric will definitely get back to you. But finally, how can people either get their hands on the product, get a personalized demo? What is the best way to go about that?
Yeah, very easy. So if you go to avpoint.com, up in the right-hand corner of the screen, you'll see a free trial link. So we will try to make it as easy as possible for you to go ahead and sign up for a trial. And typically, someone like myself, an engineer, will help get you started if you're interested. Or if not, you can certainly run on your own. And for those of you who are kind of in the government or public sector space, we do have a public sector section of the site where you can sign up for a trial there as well. So again, just on avpoint.com, very easy to find that free trial button.
Awesome. Eric, thanks so much for being with us again. We really appreciate you.
Yep. Thanks for having me on.